This video will help you sleep and relax. But before we begin, I would like to know which city you're from and what time you're watching this. Now, subscribe to the channel, relax, and let's begin. I was feeling pretty down after breaking up with my boyfriend of 3 years. We'd been having problems for a while, but the finality of it all still stung. After moping around the house for a few days, I decided I needed to get out and do something to take my mind off things. There's this old bar downtown that has pool tables in the back, so I figured I'd head there for a few games of solo pool and maybe a drink or two. The bar had that musty, worn-in feel of a place that's been around for decades. Wood-paneled walls, neon beer signs, the works. It was fairly quiet for a weeknight, just a handful of regulars scattered around nursing their beers. I made my way to the back room where the pool tables were. As I was racking up the balls for a game, this guy walked in and asked if I wanted to play a round. He seemed friendly enough, probably in his mid-30s, dark hair, decent looking. I figured why not? It beat playing alone. We started chatting as we played. His name was Mike, and he said he came to this bar pretty regularly. At first, the conversation was light and easy. We talked about our jobs, the local sports teams, that kind of thing. But as the night went on and we had a few more drinks, Mike started getting a little too forward for my liking. He kept trying to stand really close to me when it was my turn to shoot, and would find excuses to touch my arm or back. I tried to subtly create more distance between us, but he didn't seem to get the hint. After we finished our third game, Mike suggested we head back to his place to continue the party. I politely declined, saying I needed to get home. That's when his whole demeanor changed. His eyes got this cold, angry look, and he grabbed my wrist, saying, "Come on, don't be like that. We were having such a good time." I yanked my arm away and told him firmly that I was leaving. As I turned to grab my purse from the nearby chair, he snatched it first. "Give me that back right now," I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady, despite the fear building inside me. Mike just smirked and said, "Maybe I will, maybe I won't. Depends on if you decide to stop being such a tease." My heart was pounding. I glanced around, but the back room was empty except for us. I knew I needed to get out of there fast. "Fine, keep the damn purse," I snapped and bolted for the exit. As I rushed through the main bar area, I heard Mike yell something after me, but I didn't stop to listen. I ran outside and didn't slow down until I was several blocks away. Once I felt I was far enough, I stopped to catch my breath and tried to calm myself down. My hands were shaking as I pulled out my phone to call an Uber. Thank God I'd kept that in my pocket instead of my purse. As I waited for the car to arrive, I kept nervously glancing around, half expecting to see Mike appear. The ride home felt agonizingly long. I kept replaying the night in my head, wondering if I'd somehow led Mike on or if there were signs I'd missed. But no, I realized, this wasn't my fault. He was just an entitled creep who couldn't handle rejection. When I finally got home, I locked the door behind me and sank onto the couch, feeling drained. I was angry about losing my purse, but mostly just relieved to be safely away from that guy. I figured that would be the end of it, a scary encounter, but one I could put behind me. How wrong I was. The next day, I spent the morning canceling my credit cards and making plans to get a new ID and other essentials. Around lunchtime, I heard a notification ping on my phone. It was from the Find My app, saying it had detected an unknown accessory traveling with me. My blood ran cold as I realized what that meant. There was an AirTag hidden somewhere nearby that didn't belong to me. With shaking hands, I followed the app's instructions to make the tag play a sound. After a few tense moments of searching, I found it tucked into a pocket of the jacket I'd worn to the bar. Mike must have slipped it in there when he grabbed my purse. The realization that he'd been tracking my movements made me feel sick to my stomach. I immediately removed the battery from the AirTag and destroyed it. But the damage was already done. Mike knew where I lived now. The thought made my skin crawl. I spent the rest of the afternoon pacing anxiously around my house, jumping at every little noise outside. As evening fell, I was sitting in my living room trying to distract myself with TV when I noticed a car drive slowly past my house. It was an old Lincoln, dark blue. Something about it immediately set off alarm bells in my head. A few minutes later, I saw it pass by again, even slower this time. My heart started racing. I peeked out through the blinds and saw the car had stopped at the end of my street. It sat there idling for what felt like forever before finally driving off. But my relief was short-lived. Less than 10 minutes later, it was back, creeping along my street once more. This continued for hours. Sometimes the Lincoln would disappear for 30 minutes or so, but it always returned. I was too terrified to sleep. Every time I heard an engine outside, I'd rush to the window to see if it was that car again. More often than not, it was. Around 3 a.m., things escalated. The Lincoln pulled into my driveway and just sat there, engine running. I could see the silhouette of someone in the driver's seat, but couldn't make out any details in the darkness. After a few minutes that felt like an eternity, the car backed out and drove away. But I knew it would be back. I spent the rest of the night huddled in my bedroom, lights off, peeking out occasionally to see if the car had returned. It did, several more times before dawn finally broke. As soon as it was light out, I called my parents in hysterics and told them everything that had happened. They insisted I come stay with them for a while, which I gladly agreed to. It's been a week now, and I'm still too scared to return to my own home. I've filed a police report, but without concrete proof that it was Mike in that car, there's not much they can do. I'm jumping at shadows, terrified to go anywhere alone. The experience has left me feeling violated and unsafe in a way I've never felt before. I don't know if or when I'll feel secure enough to resume my normal life. The thought that this creep knows where I live and could be out there waiting for me is paralyzing. I keep replaying that night at the bar in my head, wishing I'd never gone there in the first place. But I know I can't change the past. All I can do now is try to stay safe and hope that somehow this nightmare will end. Around 9 p.m., I noticed a man I'd never seen before walk in. He looked completely out of place. Disheveled hair, wrinkled clothes that had seen better days, a wild look in his eyes. My first instinct was to ask him to leave, but he made a beeline for the bar before I could intervene. He sat down heavily on a stool, glaring at me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I approached cautiously, ready to cut him off before he even ordered. But what he said next stopped me cold. "I know what you did, Kevin." My blood ran ice cold. How did this stranger know my name, and what was he talking about? I racked my brain, trying to place his face, figure out if I'd somehow wronged him in the past. But I came up blank. "I'm sorry, sir, but I don't know what you're talking about," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Can I get you a water?" His eyes narrowed dangerously. "Don't play dumb with me," he snarled. "You can't hide from what you've done. I'm going to make sure you pay." My heart was pounding so hard, I was sure the other patrons could hear it. I glanced around, hoping someone else had noticed this bizarre confrontation, but everyone seemed absorbed in their own conversations. "Sir, I think you may have me confused with someone else," I said, my palms sweating. "I really don't know what you're referring to. If you'd like to discuss this further, maybe we could step outside." I was hoping to get him away from the other customers, in case things escalated, but he just laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that sent chills down my spine. "Oh, we'll discuss it all right," he said ominously. "But not here, not now. When you least expect it, Kevin, that's when I'll come for you." With that, he stood up abruptly and stormed out, leaving me shaken to my core. I tried to go about my work as usual, but I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that had settled over me. Who was that man? What did he think I had done? And most importantly, was he really going to come after me? The rest of my shift passed in a blur. I kept replaying the encounter in my mind, searching for some clue I might have missed. By the time I locked up at 2 a.m., I was a bundle of nerves. The short drive home felt endless, my eyes darting to every shadow and movement. I breathed a sigh of relief when I finally pulled into my driveway. Home. Safe. I did a quick perimeter check, a habit I'd picked up years ago, before heading inside. Everything looked normal. I locked the door behind me, then double-checked all the windows. Satisfied that my home was secure, I poured myself a much-needed nightcap and sank into my favorite armchair. As the adrenaline wore off, exhaustion set in. I must have dozed off, because the next thing I knew, I was jolting awake to complete darkness. The ice in my glass had melted, leaving watered-down whiskey. I checked my watch, 3:47 a.m. Something felt off. The house was silent, but not in its usual peaceful way. This silence felt heavy, oppressive. Like the quiet before a storm, I stood up slowly, every nerve on high alert. That's when I noticed it, a faint scuffing sound coming from upstairs. My bedroom. Fear gripped me. I lived alone. There shouldn't be anyone up there. I crept to the kitchen, moving as quietly as I could. My hand found the heavy cast-iron skillet I kept on the stove. Not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. Heart pounding, I made my way up the stairs. Each creak of the floorboards sounded deafening in the darkness. I paused at the top, straining my ears. Nothing. Slowly, I pushed open my bedroom door. Moonlight filtered through the curtains, casting eerie shadows. At first glance, everything seemed normal, but then I saw it. Something on my pillow that didn't belong. I flicked on the light, and my blood ran cold. There, stabbed into my pillow, was one of my own kitchen knives. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. How was this possible? I'd checked every lock, every window. There was no way anyone could have gotten in. I searched the entire house, but found no sign of forced entry. No open windows, no picked locks. It was as if the intruder had simply materialized inside. As the sun began to rise, I sat at my kitchen table, the knife in front of me, my head in my hands. The man's words from the bar kept echoing in my mind. "When you least expect it, Kevin, that's when I'll come for you." He'd made good on his threat. But how and why? What did he think I had done that warranted this level of terror? I called in sick to work that day and the next. I couldn't bring myself to leave the house. I installed a security system, changed all the locks, but deep down, I knew it wouldn't matter. Whoever this man was, whatever power he possessed, locks and alarms wouldn't stop him. Days turned into weeks. I jumped at every sound, flinched at every shadow. Sleep became a luxury I could rarely afford. I kept expecting the man to return, to finally reveal what he thought I had done. But he never did. The not knowing was almost worse than any confrontation. My mind conjured up endless scenarios, each more terrible than the last. Had I accidentally wronged someone in my past? Was I being punished for some crime I'd committed without realizing? I began to doubt my own memories, my own sense of reality. Maybe I had done something horrible and somehow blocked it out. The uncertainty was maddening. Months have passed now, and I still have no answers. I've moved to a new apartment, changed jobs, tried to start fresh. But I can never truly relax. Every time I enter a room, I half expect to see that man standing there, ready to finally reveal the truth. Sometimes I wonder if it would have been better if he had just confronted me that night at the bar. At least then I'd know what I was accused of, what I was being punished for. This limbo of fear and confusion is its own special kind of hell. I don't know if I'll ever feel safe again. I don't know if I'll ever understand what happened that night or how the intruder got into my locked house. All I know is that my life has been forever changed by a stranger's cryptic threat and a knife on a pillow. So I remain vigilant, always looking over my shoulder, always waiting for the other shoe to drop. Because deep down, I know the truth. This isn't over. Whatever game this man is playing, whatever vendetta he's pursuing, it's far from finished. And I can only hope that when he finally makes his move, I'll be ready. But in my darkest moments, in the dead of night when sleep eludes me, I wonder, will I ever truly be ready? Or am I doomed to live the rest of my life in fear, jumping at shadows, never knowing when or how the final confrontation will come? All I can do is wait and wonder and try to piece together the mystery of what I supposedly did to deserve this torment. But the answers remain frustratingly out of reach, leaving me trapped in a nightmare of my own making, or perhaps a nightmare crafted by a madman with an inexplicable grudge. Whatever the truth may be, one thing is certain: my life will never be the same. The carefree bartender I once was is gone, replaced by a man haunted by questions without answers, tormented by a threat without resolution. And as each day passes, I can't help but wonder, will I ever find peace again? Or is this state of constant fear and paranoia my new normal? Only time will tell. But until then, I'll keep looking over my shoulder, keep checking my locks, keep searching for answers. Because in this new reality I've found myself trapped in, vigilance isn't just a choice. It's a necessity for survival. Around 9 p.m., I noticed an elderly couple sitting in one of the corner booths. I hadn't seen them come in, which was odd since I usually greet everyone at the door. They weren't regulars, that's for sure. Something about them immediately struck me as off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on what it was. The man looked to be in his 80s, with wispy white hair and a gaunt face. The woman beside him was equally ancient, her silver hair pulled back in a tight bun. They sat unnaturally still, not talking or even looking at each other. Both of them just stared straight ahead at the wall, completely motionless. I figured they must be waiting to order, so I made my way over to their table. As I approached, a chill ran down my spine. Up close, there was something deeply unsettling about their appearance. The man's skin had a grayish, waxy quality to it. His eyes were sunken and lifeless. The woman wasn't much better. Her face was eerily smooth, almost like a porcelain doll. "Good evening, folks. What can I get for you tonight?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. They didn't react at all. It was like they couldn't even hear me. They just kept staring ahead with glassy eyes, Hello? Would you like to see a menu? I tried again, a bit louder this time. Still nothing. Not even a blink or a twitch. It was as if they were frozen in time. A wave of unease washed over me. This wasn't normal. Were they having some kind of medical emergency? Should I call for help? Just then, a rowdy group at the bar called out for another round. I glanced over my shoulder for a second, then turned back to the couple. To my shock, they were gone. The booth was completely empty. I blinked hard, convinced I must be seeing things. But no, the booth was definitely vacant. There was no sign that anyone had been sitting there at all. No coats, no drinks, nothing. "Hey, Karen," I called out to my co-worker. "Did you see that old couple leave just now? The ones in the corner booth?" Karen looked confused. "What couple? That booth's been empty all night." A chill ran through me. Was I losing my mind? I could have sworn they were there just moments ago. I described the couple to Karen in detail, but she insisted she hadn't seen anyone matching that description all evening. I tried to shake it off and focus on work, but I couldn't stop thinking about the creepy old couple. As the night went on, I found myself continually glancing at that corner booth, half expecting to see them materialize again. But it remained empty. By the time last call rolled around, I was exhausted and more than ready to go home. The whole incident with the couple had left me feeling deeply unsettled. I just wanted to get out of there and try to forget about it. As I was locking up, I happened to glance out the front window. My blood ran cold. There, across the street under a flickering streetlight, stood the elderly couple. They were staring directly at me with those same lifeless eyes. I stumbled backwards, my heart pounding. This couldn't be real. I squeezed my eyes shut, silently praying that when I opened them again, they'd be gone. But when I looked, they were still there. Only now they were smiling, wide, unnatural grins that stretched their papery skin. Without thinking, I bolted out the back door and ran to my car. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key in the ignition. As I peeled out of the parking lot, I caught one last glimpse of them in my rearview mirror. They hadn't moved an inch, but their heads had turned to follow my car, those horrifying grins still plastered on their faces. I didn't sleep at all that night. I kept replaying the events over and over in my mind, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. Was it some kind of hallucination, a shared delusion, or something far more sinister? In the days that followed, I questioned my sanity. I scoured local news reports, looking for any mention of an elderly couple or strange occurrences in the area, but I found nothing. I even went back to O'Malley's and asked around, but no one else remembered seeing the couple that night. Karen maintained that the booth had been empty all evening. It was like they had never existed, but I know what I saw. Those vacant eyes, those unnaturally wide smiles, they're burned into my memory. Sometimes I still see them in my dreams, standing motionless under that streetlight, watching me. It's been months now, and I still don't have any explanation for what happened that night. Part of me hopes I never will, because deep down, I have a feeling that whatever the truth is, it's far more terrifying than anything I can imagine. I've tried to put it behind me and move on with my life, but every now and then, when I'm walking alone at night, I'll catch a glimpse of an elderly couple out of the corner of my eye, and for a split second, my heart stops as I wonder, is it them? I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe again. That night changed something in me, shook my understanding of reality to its core. All I know is that there are things in this world that defy explanation, and sometimes it's better not to look too closely at the shadows. That morning started like any other. We broke camp at dawn, the air crisp and scented with pine. I remember thinking how perfect the conditions were. Clear skies, mild temperatures. If only I'd known what was coming. There was one hiker in our group who had seemed a bit off from the start. John was his name, mid-30s, kept to himself, barely spoke during our safety briefing. I'd chalked it up to first-time jitters or maybe social anxiety. Lots of city folks get overwhelmed by the wilderness at first. But as we hiked that morning, I started noticing John muttering to himself, casting suspicious glances at the rest of the group. We stopped for a water break around 10 a.m. I was checking my map when I heard a commotion behind me. I turned to see John shoving another hiker, screaming incoherently about how we were all part of it and trying to get him. Before I could even process what was happening, John had grabbed a large rock and was advancing on the group. My training kicked in, and I immediately put myself between John and the others. "Everyone back away slowly," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "John, put down the rock. We're not here to hurt you." But John was beyond reason. His eyes were wild, unfocused. He lunged at me, swinging the rock. I managed to dodge, but just barely. The rock grazed my shoulder, sending a jolt of pain down my arm. In that moment, I realized this was far beyond anything my guide training had prepared me for. "Run!" I shouted to the group. "Back down the trail! Go!" They didn't need to be told twice. As they fled, I kept myself between them and John, who was now in a full-blown psychotic rage. What followed was the most terrifying experience of my life. John pursued me through the forest, screaming threats and accusations. I used every trick I knew to try to lose him, doubling back, crossing streams, using the terrain to my advantage. But he was relentless, driven by some internal demons I couldn't begin to understand. At one point, I thought I'd lost him. I paused behind a large boulder, desperately trying to catch my breath and plan my next move. That's when I heard a twig snap behind me. I whirled around to see John lunging at me with a crude spear he'd fashioned from a broken tree branch. Pure instinct took over. I ducked and rolled, feeling the spear whoosh past my head. As I came up, I grabbed a fallen branch and swung it with all my might. It connected with John's knee with a sickening crack. He went down, howling in pain. I didn't wait to see if he'd get up. I ran. I ran harder and faster than I ever had in my life. Branches whipped my face. Roots threatened to trip me, but I didn't slow down. I had no idea where I was going. All sense of direction was lost in the chaos. My only thought was to put as much distance between myself and John as possible. I don't know how long I ran. It felt like hours. Eventually, I found myself at the edge of a small clearing. My legs gave out and I collapsed, gasping for air. As the adrenaline began to fade, the pain in my shoulder flared. I looked down to see my shirt stained with blood where the rock had hit me. As I sat there, trying to gather my wits, the full weight of what had happened began to sink in. I was lost in the wilderness, injured, with a violent madman potentially still on my trail. For the first time in my guiding career, I felt true fear grip me. Not just fear for myself, but for my clients. Had they made it to safety? Was John pursuing them now? I forced myself to focus. I needed to find my bearings and get back to base camp. Using the sun's position and my knowledge of the area, I made my best guess at the direction I needed to go. Every snapping twig, every rustle in the underbrush made me jump. I kept expecting to see John burst out of the trees at any moment. The journey back was a blur of paranoia and exhaustion. I pushed myself hard, ignoring the pain and fatigue. As the sun began to set, I finally spotted a familiar ridge. Relief flooded through me as I realized I was close to base camp. I stumbled into camp just as darkness was falling. The senior guide on duty, Mike, took one look at my battered state and immediately called for medical assistance. As the camp medic patched me up, I recounted the horrifying events of the day. Mike informed me that the rest of my group had made it back safely hours ago. They'd immediately reported what had happened, and search and rescue teams had been mobilized. As we spoke, helicopters were scanning the area for any sign of John. In the days that followed, as I gave statements to the police and park rangers, the full story came out. John had a history of mental illness and had recently stopped taking his medication. His family had no idea he'd signed up for a wilderness trek. The guilt I felt for not noticing the signs earlier was overwhelming. They never found John. The search was called off after a week. Sometimes I still wonder what became of him out there in the wilderness. Did he succumb to his injuries? Is he still out there, living as some kind of mountain phantom? It's been months since that day, but I still have nightmares about being chased through those woods. I haven't led another tour since then. The wilderness I once loved now feels tainted, full of hidden dangers. I know rationally that what happened was a freak occurrence, but I can't shake the feeling that the next time I step onto a trail, something terrible will be waiting for me. I'm sharing this story as a warning to other guides and outdoor enthusiasts. You never truly know the people you're leading into the wilderness. Trust your instincts. If something feels off, it probably is. And always, always be prepared for the unexpected, because out there in the wild, anything can happen. I never thought a routine hiking trip would turn my life upside down, but here I am, still trying to make sense of what happened that day on the mountain. It's been 3 months since I guided that strange German guy up to Cascade Ridge, and I can't shake the feeling that I witnessed something I wasn't supposed to see. It all started when I got a call from an international number. The man on the other end had a thick German accent and introduced himself as Klaus Schmidt. He said he needed an experienced guide to take him to a specific spot on Cascade Ridge in 2 days' time. Something about his tone made me uneasy, but I couldn't afford to turn down work, so I agreed. When I met Klaus at the trailhead that crisp autumn morning, my unease only grew. He was tall and gaunt, with piercing blue eyes that seemed to look right through me. He carried only a small backpack and wore hiking boots that looked brand new. As we set off up the trail, I tried to make small talk, asking what brought him all the way from Germany to hike this particular mountain. He gave me a thin smile and said simply, "I have my reasons." The first few miles were uneventful, but I couldn't shake a growing sense of dread. Klaus barely spoke, and when he did, it was only to ask how much farther we had to go. His eyes kept darting around, scanning the trees and rocks as if searching for something. At one point, I saw him pull out a folded piece of paper from his pocket and study it intently before quickly stuffing it away again. About halfway up the mountain, we stopped for a water break. As Klaus took a long drink from his bottle, I noticed his hand was shaking slightly. When he caught me looking, his eyes narrowed. "Is something wrong?" he asked sharply. I shook my head. "No, just making sure you're handling the altitude okay." He grunted and shouldered his pack. "I'm fine. We need to keep moving." As we continued climbing, Klaus's behavior became even stranger. He started muttering to himself in German, too low for me to make out the words. Every so often he'd stop abruptly, close his eyes, and turn in a slow circle before pointing in a seemingly random direction and insisting we go that way. I tried to tell him we needed to stick to the trail, but he became agitated and said we had to follow his calculations. By the time we neared the summit, my nerves were frayed. This was unlike any client I'd ever had before. Part of me wanted to turn back, to get as far away from this unsettling man as possible. But we were almost there, and I told myself I was just being paranoid. Finally, we reached the ridge Klaus had specified. It was a stark, windswept stretch of rock with stunning views of the surrounding peaks. But Klaus didn't seem to notice the scenery. He strode to a particular outcropping and dropped to his knees, running his hands over the stone as if searching for something. "This is it," he breathed. "Finally." I stood back, unsure what to do, as Klaus pulled a small device from his pack. It looked like some kind of detector or scanner. He waved it slowly over the rocks, his entire body tense with concentration. Suddenly, the device emitted a high-pitched beep. Klaus's eyes widened, and he let out a triumphant laugh that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. He turned to me with a manic grin. "I need privacy now. Wait over there and do not watch me." Feeling increasingly uneasy, I retreated to a spot about 50 yards away. I couldn't see exactly what Klaus was doing, but I could hear the sound of rocks scraping and what seemed to be muffled electronic tones. After about 20 minutes, I heard a strange humming noise that seemed to vibrate through the very mountain beneath my feet. Then silence. When Klaus called me back over, I was shocked by his appearance. His face was flushed and his eyes were fever bright. He looked almost energized in a way that didn't seem natural after our grueling hike. But what struck me most was his expression. The intense, driven look he'd worn all day was gone, replaced by an eerie calm. "We can go now," he said serenely. "I've gotten what I came for." The hike back down was surreal. Klaus chatted easily about trivial things like the weather and German cuisine, as if our tense journey up had never happened. I found myself giving one-word answers, my mind reeling as I tried to process the day's events. When we reached the trailhead, Klaus shook my hand and thanked me warmly. As he turned to leave, he paused and fixed me with those unnerving blue eyes one last time. "You saw nothing unusual today," he said softly. "Remember that." I nodded numbly and watched him walk to a black SUV with tinted windows that I hadn't noticed before. As it pulled away, I could have sworn I saw a figure in the back seat that wasn't Klaus. I tried to put the whole bizarre experience out of my mind over the next few weeks. But then the men in suits showed up at my door. They flashed FBI badges and asked to come in. For the next 2 hours, they grilled me about every detail of my trip with Klaus. What exactly did he do on the ridge? Did he meet anyone else? Did he mention any organizations or use any strange terminology? I told them everything I could remember, but they seemed frustrated by my lack of concrete information. Before they left, one agent fixed me with a stern look. "If you remember anything else, no matter how small, you contact us immediately. This is a matter of national security." Those words have haunted me ever since. What the hell happened on that mountain? Who was Klaus, really? And what did he find up there? I've gone back to that spot on the ridge a few times, searching for any clues, but there's no sign anything unusual ever happened. Sometimes I wonder if I imagined the whole thing. But then I remember the look in Klaus's eyes when he came back from the outcropping, that unsettling serenity. And I know that whatever occurred that day was all too real. I still work as a guide, but I'm much more cautious now about the clients I take on. And every time I'm on the mountain, I can't help scanning the rocks and trees, half expecting to see glowing symbols or hear that strange humming again. I don't know if I'll ever get answers about what really happened that day, but one thing's for sure. I'll never forget my hike with the mysterious German man who seemed to find exactly what he was looking for, high up on Cascade Ridge. I never thought I'd find myself in a situation like this. As a wilderness guide, I've led countless hikes through the rugged terrain of the Cascade Mountains, but nothing could have prepared me for what happened that day. It was a crisp autumn morning when I set out on a routine trail check. The air was thick with the scent of pine, and the forest floor was carpeted with fallen leaves. I'd been walking for about 2 hours when I spotted something out of place in the distance, a flash of bright blue against the earthy tones of the forest. As I approached, my heart began to race. It was a person, lying motionless on the ground. I quickened my pace, my mind racing through all the possible scenarios. When I reached him, I saw it was a man, probably in his mid-30s, wearing a blue hiking jacket. He was unconscious but breathing. I knelt beside him, checking for any visible injuries. There was a nasty gash on his forehead, and his right ankle was swollen. I tried to wake him, gently shaking his shoulder and calling out, but he didn't respond. I knew I had to act fast. The nearest ranger station was about 5 miles away, and there was no cell service in this part of the forest. I had a decision to make: stay with him and hope another hiker would come along, or attempt to carry him to safety myself. I looked at the unconscious man, then at the rugged trail ahead. The thought of leaving him there, vulnerable to the elements and wildlife, was unthinkable. I took a deep breath, steeling myself for what I knew would be an incredibly challenging journey. With a grunt of effort, I hoisted the man onto my shoulders in a fireman's carry. He was heavy, probably around 180 pounds, and I staggered under the weight. But I gritted my teeth and took the first step forward. The first mile was the hardest. Every step was a battle against gravity and exhaustion. The trail was uneven, littered with rocks and roots that threatened to trip me at every turn. I had to move slowly, carefully, placing each foot to avoid stumbling. Sweat poured down my face, soaking my shirt. My muscles screamed in protest, but I pushed on. I couldn't afford to stop. This man's life could depend on how quickly I could get him to help. As I trudged on, I tried to distract myself from the pain and fatigue by talking to the unconscious man. "Hang in there, buddy," I panted. "We're going to get you help. Just stay with me." About halfway through the journey, I had to stop. My legs were shaking and my lungs were burning. I gently lowered the man to the ground and collapsed beside him, gulping air. For a moment, doubt crept in. Could I really do this? Was I crazy for even trying? But as I looked at the pale face of the stranger I was trying to save, I knew I had to keep going. I allowed myself only a few minutes of rest before struggling back to my feet and lifting the man once again. The last 2 miles were a blur of pain and determination. Every step was agony, but I forced myself to keep moving. I focused on the rhythm of my breathing, on the crunch of leaves beneath my feet, on anything but the fire in my muscles and the weight on my shoulders. When I finally saw the ranger station through the trees, I almost cried with relief. With a surge of energy I didn't know I had left, I staggered the last few 100 yards. I burst through the door of the station, startling the 2 rangers inside. "Help!" I gasped, my legs finally giving out as I lowered the man to the floor. Found him, on the trail, unconscious. The rangers sprang into action, calling for medical assistance and tending to the injured hiker. As for me, I collapsed into a chair, every muscle in my body trembling with exhaustion. The next few hours passed in a haze. Paramedics arrived, whisking the hiker away to a hospital. The rangers insisted on checking me over too, concerned about the ordeal I'd put my body through. It wasn't until later that evening, as I sat wrapped in a blanket sipping hot tea, that the full weight of what had happened hit me. I had carried a man for 5 miles through challenging terrain. I had potentially saved his life. The rangers told me they'd received word from the hospital. The hiker was awake and stable. He had suffered a concussion and a sprained ankle from a fall, but thanks to my actions, he would make a full recovery. As I drove home that night, my body aching but my spirit soaring, I reflected on the day's events. I've always believed in the importance of helping others, but this experience had shown me the true depths of human endurance and compassion. I never saw that hiker again, never learned his name or his story. But in a way, that doesn't matter. What matters is that when faced with a critical moment, I made the choice to help. And that choice, as grueling and challenging as it was, had made all the difference. This experience changed me. It showed me what I was capable of, both physically and mentally. It reinforced my love for the wilderness and my respect for its dangers. But most importantly, it reminded me of the profound impact we can have on each other's lives, often in ways we never expect. Now, whenever I lead hikes, I share this story with my groups, not to boast, but to emphasize the importance of preparedness, of looking out for one another, and of pushing ourselves beyond what we think we're capable of when someone else's life is on the line. That day in the forest tested me in ways I never imagined, but it also taught me lessons I'll carry for the rest of my life. And though my muscles have long since recovered, the memory of that journey, every agonizing step, every moment of doubt, and the ultimate triumph will stay with me forever. I was Chris Fowler's hiking partner on that fateful day in 2016, when he vanished without a trace on the Pacific Crest Trail. Even now, years later, I still struggle to make sense of what happened. The events of that day are seared into my memory, haunting my thoughts and dreams. Chris and I had been planning our PCT through hike for over a year. We'd spent months preparing, poring over maps, testing gear, and getting in shape for the grueling 2,650-mile journey from Mexico to Canada. Chris was an experienced outdoorsman. This wasn't his first long-distance trek. He'd already completed the Appalachian Trail and seemed more than ready for the challenges of the PCT. We set out from the Mexican border in early April, our spirits high as we began the adventure of a lifetime. The first few weeks were tough but exhilarating as we made our way through the California desert. Chris was in his element, reveling in the rugged beauty of the landscape. His enthusiasm was infectious, and I found myself caught up in his sense of wonder and excitement. As we entered the Sierra Nevada range in June, the terrain became more challenging. We were climbing to higher elevations, dealing with snow-covered passes and icy river crossings. But Chris remained confident and sure-footed, always scouting ahead to find the safest routes. The day it happened started like any other. We broke camp early, hoping to make good mileage before the afternoon heat set in. The trail was winding through a particularly remote and rugged section of the Sierras. Sheer granite cliffs towered above us on one side, while a steep ravine plunged down on the other. The narrow path demanded our full attention with each step. Chris was about 50 yards ahead of me when I paused to adjust my pack and take a swig of water. I called out to him, "Hey Chris, wait up a sec." He turned and waved, then continued around a bend in the trail. That was the last time I ever saw him. When I rounded the corner myself, less than a minute later, the trail ahead was empty. I figured Chris had just picked up his pace, so I hurried to catch up. But after a few minutes of seeing no sign of him, an uneasy feeling began to creep over me. "Chris," I called out. No response, just the whisper of wind through the pines and the distant cry of a hawk. I quickened my pace, scanning the path ahead and the terrain on either side. Nothing. It was as if he'd simply vanished into thin air. As the minutes ticked by, my unease grew into full-blown panic. I backtracked, searching frantically for any sign of where he might have left the trail. But the rocky ground held no footprints, and the dense undergrowth showed no evidence of disturbance. I spent hours scouring the area, my voice growing hoarse from shouting his name. As the sun began to sink towards the horizon, I was faced with the agonizing decision of whether to continue searching in the fading light or make my way to the nearest ranger station for help. With a heavy heart, I chose the latter, knowing that I'd need more resources to have any hope of finding Chris. It took me until nearly midnight to reach the ranger station. I burst in, wild-eyed and babbling about my missing friend. The rangers sprang into action, immediately calling in search and rescue teams. By dawn, a full-scale search operation was underway. For days, teams of professionals and volunteers combed the mountains. Helicopters swept low over the canyons, while search dogs sniffed for any trace of Chris's scent. I joined every search party I could, pushing myself to exhaustion as we scoured mile after mile of unforgiving terrain. But as the days turned into weeks, hope began to fade. No clues were found, no scraps of clothing, no abandoned gear, nothing to indicate what might have happened to Chris. It was as if he'd been plucked off the face of the earth by some unseen force. The official search was eventually called off, but I couldn't bring myself to leave. I spent the rest of the summer in those mountains, hiking every trail and exploring every ravine I could reach. I interrogated other hikers, chased down every far-fetched theory and rumor. But in the end, I was left with nothing but questions and a gnawing sense of guilt. Even now, years later, I find myself replaying that day over and over in my mind. Could I have done something differently? If I'd been just a few steps closer, would I have seen what happened? The not knowing is the hardest part. Did he fall? Was he attacked by an animal? Did he simply decide to walk away from his life and disappear? Or was there something stranger at work? Something beyond rational explanation? I've heard all the theories over the years. Some think he staged his own disappearance, though that seems completely out of character for the Chris I knew. Others point to possible criminal activity, though no evidence of foul play was ever found. There are even those who speculate about paranormal explanations, everything from alien abductions to interdimensional portals. But for me, the mystery remains as impenetrable as it was on that first awful day. I've returned to that section of trail many times since, hoping against hope to find some clue we missed. But the mountains keep their secrets, and Chris's fate remains unknown. The experience changed me profoundly. I no longer take anything for granted. Not the people in my life, not the ground beneath my feet. I've become almost obsessively cautious, always hyper-aware of my surroundings and potential dangers. And I'm haunted by a sense that the world is far stranger and more unpredictable than we like to believe. I often wonder what Chris would make of all this if he knew. Would he be touched by how many people have searched for him? How his story has captured the public imagination? Or would he be frustrated by our inability to solve the puzzle of his disappearance? There are times when I think I've come to terms with never knowing what really happened, but then I'll have a dream where I'm back on that trail, and for a split second I see Chris just ahead of me. I call out, and this time he stops and turns. I run towards him, desperate to close the distance. But no matter how fast I run, he always remains just out of reach, fading away into the mist before I can get there. I wake from these dreams with a renewed determination to keep searching, to keep Chris's memory alive. I've connected with his family and other hikers who knew him, sharing stories and theories. We've created online forums and support groups for those affected by similar wilderness disappearances. It's a way of honoring Chris and all the others who have vanished without a trace in the wild places of the world. But in my darkest moments, I'm haunted by the possibility that I'll never know what became of my friend, that his disappearance will remain an unsolved mystery, a cautionary tale whispered around campfires. And I'm left to grapple with the knowledge that sometimes the wilderness doesn't give up its secrets, no matter how desperately we search for answers. My name is Ethan, and I work as a freelance journalist. Nature and outdoor adventure stories are my specialty, so I'm no stranger to solo camping trips in remote wilderness areas. But nothing could have prepared me for what I encountered that night in Gallatin. I had been hiking and camping in the forest for about a week, gathering material for an article on backcountry safety and wilderness survival skills. The irony of that isn't lost on me now. I thought I knew how to stay safe in the wilderness. I was wrong. It was my last night before heading back to civilization. I had hiked deep into a secluded area of the forest, far off the main trails. As dusk fell, I set up my small tent in a clearing, got a campfire going, and settled in for a quiet evening of reviewing my notes and planning out the structure of my article. The fire crackled softly as night descended. Shadows danced at the edges of the clearing. An owl hooted in the distance. It was peaceful, serene even. I remember thinking how lucky I was to experience such raw, unspoiled nature. If only I had known what was lurking just beyond the firelight. It must have been close to midnight when I first sensed something was off. The forest had gone eerily quiet, no chirping insects, no rustling leaves, just dead silence. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up. I peered into the darkness beyond my campsite, straining my eyes and ears. For a moment I thought I glimpsed movement in the shadows, a flicker of something pale. But when I looked directly at it, there was nothing there. I told myself I was being paranoid. Too many nights alone in the woods playing tricks on my mind. I decided to turn in for the night, hoping some sleep would calm my nerves. Big mistake. I had just crawled into my sleeping bag when I heard it. The unmistakable sound of footsteps crunching through the underbrush, and they were coming straight for my tent. My heart began to race. I lay completely still, hardly daring to breathe. The footsteps grew closer, closer, until they stopped right outside my tent. For several agonizing seconds, there was only silence. Then a gravelly voice spoke. "I know you're in there. Come on out and let's have us a little chat." I broke out in a cold sweat. This was no forest ranger or fellow camper. Something in that voice chilled me to my core. "I said come out," the voice growled. "Don't make me come in there after you." Panic overrode my paralysis. I scrambled out of my sleeping bag and unzipped the tent, my hands shaking. As I emerged into the moonlight, I came face to face with my visitor. He was a haggard-looking man, probably in his 50s, with wild gray hair and a scraggly beard. His eyes had a crazed, feral glint that made my blood run cold. "Well, hello there, city boy," he leered, revealing a mouthful of rotting teeth. "Mighty dangerous for you to be out here all alone." I stammered out a response, trying to keep my voice steady. "I'm just a camper passing through. I don't want any trouble." The man's grin widened. "Oh, there won't be any trouble. Not if you cooperate." That's when I noticed the large hunting knife in his hand, its blade glinting in the moonlight. "Now," he said, pressing the tip of the blade against my chest, "why don't you show me what valuables you've got in that tent of yours?" My mind raced. I knew I had to play along, to buy time to figure a way out of this. "Of course," I said. "I've got some cash and a nice camera in there. It's all yours." I turned to re-enter the tent, planning to grab my satellite phone and call for help. But as I bent down, white-hot pain exploded in my back. The madman had stabbed me. I collapsed to the ground, gasping in agony. The attacker loomed over me, knife raised for another strike. In that moment, survival instinct took over. I lashed out with my legs, catching him in the knees. He stumbled back, momentarily off balance. Ignoring the searing pain in my back, I scrambled to my feet and ran. I plunged blindly into the dark forest, branches whipping my face as I crashed through the underbrush. Behind me, I could hear the enraged shouts of my pursuer. I ran until my lungs felt like they would burst. The wound in my back was a fiery agony with each pounding step, but fear and adrenaline pushed me onward. After what felt like hours, I finally slowed, gasping for breath. I strained my ears, listening for any sign of pursuit. Nothing but the soft rustling of leaves in the night breeze. I slumped against a tree, my legs giving out. The events of the night caught up with me in a rush. I began to shake uncontrollably, the horror of what had just happened sinking in. As the adrenaline faded, the pain from my stab wound intensified. I gingerly felt around my back. My shirt was soaked with blood. I knew I needed medical attention, fast. But I was lost in the pitch-black forest, miles from any help. My tent, with all my supplies and my satellite phone, was back at the campsite. I was alone, injured, and being hunted by a deranged killer. I've never felt so utterly helpless and terrified in my life. I don't know how long I huddled there in the darkness, drifting in and out of consciousness. The pain was excruciating. I was sure I was going to die out there in the wilderness, my body never to be found. As the faintest hints of dawn began to lighten the sky, I heard voices in the distance. For a heart-stopping moment, I feared my attacker had found me. But then I made out the words, park rangers calling out, searching. Using the last of my strength, I called for help. The rangers found me a short while later. I was rushed to the hospital, barely clinging to life. The doctors later told me I was lucky. The knife had missed any vital organs. A few more hours, and I likely would have bled out. As I recovered in the hospital, I learned more details about what had happened. The rangers had been alerted when I failed to check out of the backcountry as scheduled. They found the scene of violence at my campsite and launched a search. My attacker turned out to be a homeless man named Thomas Blake, who had been living in the forest. He had a history of mental illness and violent behavior. They caught him a few days later, still carrying my stolen camping gear. Blake was eventually convicted of attempted murder and is now serving a lengthy prison sentence. But that's little consolation to me. The events of that night left deep psychological scars that may never fully heal. I still have nightmares about those terrifying moments in the forest. The glint of the knife, the madman's leering grin, the blind panic as I ran for my life. It all comes rushing back with vivid clarity. I haven't been camping since that night. The thought of being alone in the wilderness fills me with paralyzing dread. My passion for outdoor journalism is gone, replaced by a gnawing anxiety I can't seem to shake. Sometimes I wonder if I'll ever feel truly safe again. The attack opened my eyes to how fragile our sense of security really is. In the blink of an eye, my world was shattered by random, senseless violence. I'm sharing my story now as a warning to others. We like to think we're safe in nature, surrounded by beauty and serenity. But danger can lurk in the most unexpected places. Always be aware of your surroundings. Trust your instincts if something feels off, and never take your safety for granted. I was lucky to survive my encounter in Gallatin National Forest. Others may not be so fortunate. Stay safe out there and watch your back. You never know what might be hiding just beyond the shadows. As I rounded the corner near the old cemetery, I noticed something odd. There was a small figure standing just inside the gates, barely visible in the dim streetlight. I slowed my pace, squinting to get a better look. It was a little girl, couldn't have been more than 9 or 10 years old. She was wearing a thin white dress, completely inappropriate for the cold weather. My first thought was confusion. What was a child doing alone in a cemetery at this time of night? As I got closer, I could see she was shivering, her arms wrapped tightly around herself. She looked scared and lost. "Hey there," I called out softly, not wanting to startle her. "Are you all right? Do you need help?" The girl's head snapped up and she stared at me with wide, frightened eyes. She didn't say anything, just kept shivering and looking around nervously. I approached slowly, holding my hands up in what I hoped was a non-threatening gesture. "It's okay. I'm not going to hurt you. Are you lost? Where are your parents?" Still no response. Up close, I could see how pale she was, her skin almost translucent in the faint light. Her long, dark hair hung in messy tangles around her face. Something about her appearance made me deeply uneasy, but I pushed the feeling aside. This was clearly a child in distress who needed help. "Listen, it's freezing out here and it's not safe for you to be alone. Let me call someone to help, okay?" I reached for my phone, intending to dial the police. That's when everything changed. The girl's entire demeanor shifted in an instant. Her eyes narrowed and her mouth twisted into a snarl. "No!" she shrieked, the sudden sound making me jump. "Don't call anyone! Leave me alone!" Before I could react, she whirled around and took off running into the cemetery. I stood there stunned for a moment, then instinctively started to follow her. "Wait," I called out. "Come back. It's not safe." I sprinted through the gates, my eyes straining in the darkness. The girl was incredibly fast, darting between gravestones and monuments. I could barely make out her white dress flitting through the shadows ahead of me. The rational part of my brain was screaming at me to stop, to turn around and get out of there. But some other instinct drove me forward, desperate to make sure this child was okay. I chased her deeper into the cemetery, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The world around me seemed to grow darker and colder with each step. The girl's laughter echoed off the stone markers, a high, eerie sound that sent chills down my spine. Suddenly, I lost sight of her completely. I spun in a circle, searching frantically. "Hello?" I called out, my voice shaking. "Where are you? Please, I just want to help." Silence. The cemetery was utterly still and quiet. Even the normal nighttime sounds of the city seemed muffled and far away. I stood there, panting, a growing sense of dread settling over me. That's when I heard it, a soft giggle directly behind me. I whirled around, heart pounding, but there was nothing there. Just rows of weathered gravestones stretching into the darkness. I stumbled backwards, nearly tripping over a low stone marker. This was wrong. All of it was so wrong. I turned and ran, no longer caring about the girl, only wanting to get out of that place as quickly as possible. I didn't stop running until I was several blocks away, the lights and sounds of the city enveloping me once again. I bent over, hands on my knees, gulping in air and trying to make sense of what had just happened. Had I imagined it all? Was I going crazy from the stress of school? But no, I could still clearly picture the girl's face, hear her scream echoing in my ears. It had been real. Somehow, impossibly, it had been real. I made my way home in a daze, unable to shake the feeling of wrongness that clung to me. I took a long, scalding shower, scrubbing my skin raw as if I could wash away the memory. That night, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the girl's face twisted in that inhuman snarl. I heard phantom giggles in the darkness of my room. The next day, against my better judgment, I went back to the cemetery in the light of day. I retraced my steps from the night before, searching for, I don't know what, some sign, some explanation. But there was nothing out of the ordinary, just an old, peaceful graveyard. I even went to the police station, stumbling through an explanation of what had happened. The officer listened patiently, but I could tell he didn't really believe me. He gently suggested that perhaps I'd been more tired than I realized, that the mind can play tricks in the dark. Maybe he was right. Maybe it was all just a hallucination brought on by exhaustion and an overactive imagination. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. What I experienced that night was real, even if I couldn't explain it. In the weeks and months that followed, I tried to put it out of my mind. I avoided that part of town, especially after dark. I threw myself into my studies, into my friends and social life. But the memory lingered, always there in the back of my mind. I graduated that spring and left Lancaster, eager for a fresh start somewhere new. But even now, years later, I still think about that night. I've researched local legends, ghost stories, anything that might shed some light on what I encountered. I've never found anything conclusive. Sometimes I wonder if I should have done more to help that girl, even though logically I know there was nothing else I could have done. Was she a ghost, a demon, some other kind of supernatural entity? Or was she a real child in danger, and I failed her by running away? I'll probably never know the truth, but I do know this. I'll never forget the terror I felt in that cemetery, or the sound of that child's laughter echoing through the graves. It changed me, made me question everything I thought I knew about the world. To this day, I can't pass a cemetery without my heart rate spiking. I avoid being out alone after dark, and sometimes, in my dreams, I still find myself running through those shadowy paths, chasing a small figure in white that always remains just out of reach. I threw on a hoodie and headed out into the cool night air. The streets were mostly empty at that hour, just a few other night owls and partygoers stumbling home. I was lost in my own thoughts, probably contemplating the mysteries of the universe or something equally profound in my altered state. As I rounded the corner onto a quieter side street, I noticed a group of 4 guys hanging out near the entrance to an alley. They were dressed casually in jeans and hoodies, nothing too suspicious at first glance. But as I got closer, I felt the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Something about their body language and the way they were eyeing me set off alarm bells. Before I could change course, one of them called out, "Hey you, stop right there," in accented German. As they approached, I saw one of them flash what looked like a police badge. "We need to see some ID," the apparent leader said gruffly. My heart started racing. Even in my hazy state, I knew something wasn't right. These guys didn't look or act like real cops. The badge I'd glimpsed looked off somehow. Were they trying to rob me? Or worse? I knew I had to think fast. In that moment of adrenaline-fueled clarity, a crazy idea popped into my head. I decided to try and turn the tables on them by playing a character of my own. Squaring my shoulders, I put on my best stern expression and barked out in heavily accented English, "What is meaning of this? I am Russian diplomat. You have no authority to stop me." The would-be thieves hesitated. Clearly thrown off by my unexpected response, I pressed my advantage, puffing myself up and gesturing angrily. "This is outrage. I call embassy right now. My security team is on way to meet me. They will not be happy to find you harassing me." I fumbled in my pocket as if reaching for a phone, praying they wouldn't call my bluff. "You want big trouble with Russian government? Back off now, or there will be consequences." For a few tense seconds, I thought they might see through my desperate charade, but to my immense relief, doubt and uncertainty crept into their expressions. They exchanged uneasy glances, clearly weighing whether I might actually be who I claimed. The leader held up his hands in a placating gesture. "Whoa, easy there, buddy. No need to get upset. We're just doing our job, checking IDs. You know, standard procedure." I fixed him with my sternest glare. "Your job is harassment. I will report this. Now you leave or my team arrives in 2 minutes. Your choice." That seemed to be the final straw. Muttering amongst themselves, they began to back away. All right, no problem here. You have a good night, sir," the leader said, trying to save face. I maintained my blustering persona until they disappeared around the corner. Only then did I let out a shaky breath, feeling my knees go weak as the adrenaline drained away. Holy shit, I couldn't believe that actually worked. Still trembling slightly, I hustled the rest of the way to the store, constantly looking over my shoulder. I grabbed my snacks in record time and practically sprinted back home, taking a different route just to be safe. When I finally made it back to my apartment, I collapsed onto the couch, my heart still pounding. My roommates were passed out, oblivious to the ordeal I'd just been through. I sat there in the dark for a long time, munching on my hard-earned snacks and trying to process what had happened. The whole thing felt surreal, like something out of a movie. Had I really just faced down a group of criminals by pretending to be a Russian diplomat? The more I thought about it, the more absurd it seemed. But the fear and adrenaline I'd felt were all too real. I couldn't shake the feeling of how differently things could have gone. If I'd frozen up or they'd called my bluff, who knows what might have happened? The thought sent chills down my spine. Over the next few days, I found myself jumping at shadows and eyeing every stranger on the street with suspicion. I kept expecting those guys to show up again, to get revenge for being fooled, but nothing happened. Life in Berlin went on as usual, the city oblivious to my private drama. I debated whether to report the incident to the real police, but ultimately decided against it. What would I even say? That I'd scared off some fake cops by pretending to be a Russian diplomat while high. Yeah, that would go over well. As time passed, the fear faded, but the memory remained vivid. It became a story I'd tell at parties, embellishing the details a bit each time. My friends would laugh and say I should become an actor, but they didn't understand the genuine terror I'd felt in that moment. The experience changed me in subtle ways. I became more cautious, more aware of my surroundings. Late-night munchie runs were a thing of the past. I made sure to stock up on snacks before partaking in any extracurricular activities. And I developed a newfound appreciation for the power of quick thinking and confidence, even in the face of danger. Sometimes I wonder about those guys. Were they experienced criminals or just opportunistic thugs? Did they ever try that fake cop routine again, or did my bizarre response scare them straight? I'll never know for sure. What I do know is that I learned an important lesson that night. The world can be a dangerous place, even in a city as vibrant and diverse as Berlin. But sometimes the best defense is a good offense, or in my case, a ridiculous, over-the-top performance. I still smoke weed occasionally, but now I always make sure I'm in a safe environment, And whenever I'm out late at night, I keep my wits about me. You never know when you might need to channel your inner Russian diplomat to get out of a tight spot. The incident serves as a reminder that life can throw unexpected challenges our way at any moment. It's up to us to stay calm, think on our feet, and find creative solutions. And sometimes, the most unlikely strategies can yield surprising results. I often wonder what would have happened if I'd reacted differently that night. Would I have been robbed, beaten, or worse? The possibilities are chilling. But instead, thanks to a moment of marijuana-induced inspiration and sheer audacity, I walked away unscathed with a story I'll never forget. Berlin is still my home, and I love this city with all its quirks and surprises. But now I navigate its streets with a bit more caution and a lot more awareness. And every now and then, when I pass that fateful corner, I can't help but smile at the memory of the night I outwitted a group of criminals with nothing but quick thinking and broken English. It's a reminder that sometimes the most powerful weapon we have is our own mind, and that even in our most vulnerable moments, we're capable of summoning strength and courage we never knew we had. So here's to embracing the unexpected, thinking outside the box, and finding humor in even the scariest situations, because sometimes that's all we've got. I found a decent 2-bedroom apartment near campus and was thrilled when I managed to secure a roommate through an online listing. Her name was Yuki, and she was an international student from Japan. We exchanged a few messages, and everything seemed normal. She seemed polite and quiet, which was perfect for me as I needed to focus on my studies. The day Yuki moved in, I greeted her warmly. She was petite with long black hair and spoke in a soft, almost whisper-like voice. At first, I thought she was just shy, maybe struggling with the language barrier. I tried to make her feel welcome, showing her around the apartment and helping her settle in. But something felt off. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but there was an unsettling vibe about her. Her eyes seemed to follow me constantly, even when I wasn't looking directly at her. I brushed it off, telling myself I was just being paranoid and that she was probably just curious about her new roommate. A few days passed, and things started to get weird. I'd be sitting in the living room, working on my laptop, and I'd catch a glimpse of Yuki standing in the hallway, just watching me. She'd quickly disappear into her room when I looked up, but I could feel her presence lingering. One evening, I was cooking dinner in the kitchen when I felt that familiar prickle on the back of my neck. I turned around, and there she was, standing in the doorway, her eyes fixed on me. I tried to break the tension with a smile and asked if she wanted to join me for dinner. She shook her head slowly, never breaking eye contact, and then just walked away. I lost my appetite after that. The balcony became my sanctuary. I'd often sit out there to study or just to get some fresh air, but even that peace was short-lived. I started noticing Yuki's silhouette behind the curtains of her room, which faced the balcony. She'd stand there for hours, just observing. I tried to convince myself that maybe she was just looking at the view, but deep down I knew better. Things escalated quickly after that. I'd wake up in the middle of the night to use the bathroom, and I'd find Yuki standing in the hallway, perfectly still, her eyes gleaming in the darkness. She never said anything, never explained why she was there. She'd just stare at me until I retreated to my room, my heart pounding in my chest. I started locking my bedroom door at night, but that didn't help the feeling of being watched. Sometimes I'd hear soft footsteps outside my door, stopping right in front of it. I'd hold my breath, waiting for something to happen, but it never did. The footsteps would eventually retreat, but the fear remained. One particularly stressful day, I decided to take a long, hot shower to relax. As I was rinsing the shampoo out of my hair, I felt that familiar sensation of being watched. I opened my eyes, and through the steamy glass of the shower door, I saw Yuki's outline. She was standing there, motionless, her hand pressed against the glass. I froze, unable to move or speak. We stayed like that for what felt like an eternity before she finally turned and left. I was terrified. I wanted to confront her, to demand an explanation, but every time I tried to bring it up, the words would die in my throat. There was something in her eyes that made me feel like prey, like if I challenged her, things would only get worse. I started spending more time on campus, coming home only to sleep. But even then, I couldn't escape the feeling of her presence. I'd lie awake at night, listening for any sound of movement outside my door. Sometimes, I'd hear her whispering in Japanese, the words unintelligible, but the tone sending chills down my spine. My grades started to suffer. I couldn't concentrate on my studies, constantly looking over my shoulder, expecting to see Yuki's intense gaze. My friends noticed the change in me, asking if everything was okay. But how could I explain it, that my roommate was silently terrorizing me without ever laying a finger on me? One night I came home late from a study group, exhausted and hoping to just crash in my bed. As I approached our apartment door, I heard strange noises coming from inside. It sounded like scratching? I hesitated, my hand on the doorknob, fear gripping my heart. I took a deep breath and opened the door. The apartment was dark, but I could make out Yuki's figure in the living room. She was facing the wall, her fingers dragging across it, creating that eerie scratching sound. I flicked on the lights, and what I saw made my blood run cold. The entire wall was covered in Japanese characters, scratched into the paint. Yuki turned to look at me, her eyes wide and unblinking, a small smile playing on her lips. I couldn't take it anymore. I ran to my room, locked the door, and started packing my things. I didn't care about the lease or my deposit. I needed to get out of there. As I was shoving clothes into my suitcase, I heard a soft tapping on my door. Yuki's voice, barely above a whisper, came through the wood. "Jules, why are you leaving? We're just getting to know each other." I didn't respond. I finished packing in record time, my hands shaking so badly I could barely zip up my suitcase. When I finally gathered the courage to open my door, Yuki was gone. The apartment was silent, but I could feel her presence, like a heavy blanket smothering me. I left that night, crashing on a friend's couch and making up a story about a water leak in the apartment. The next day, I went to the housing office and begged them to let me out of my lease. I told them about the scratched wall, but when they went to investigate, the wall was pristine. There was no sign of the Japanese characters I had seen. Yuki disappeared shortly after. The housing office said she had moved out without notice, leaving no forwarding address. Part of me was relieved, but a larger part was terrified. What if she found me again? What if this was all part of some bigger plan? It's been months since that night, but I still can't shake the feeling of being watched. Sometimes, when I'm walking home late at night, I swear I can see a familiar silhouette in the shadows. I've changed my routines, my habits, even dyed my hair, but the fear remains. I never found out what Yuki wanted or why she fixated on me. Was she mentally ill? Was there some cultural misunderstanding that spiraled out of control? Or was there something more sinister at play? I'll probably never know, and in a way, that's the most terrifying part of all. Every time I see a petite woman with long black hair, my heart races. Every time I hear whispers in Japanese, I break out in a cold sweat. Yuki may be gone, but the impact she left on my life is far from over. I'm left with questions that will probably never be answered, and a paranoia that I fear will never fully fade. So if you're looking for a roommate, be careful. Sometimes the quiet ones, the ones who seem harmless at first glance, are the ones you need to watch out for, because you never know what's going on behind those unblinking eyes. I was just a regular guy living in Fredericksburg, Virginia, with my wife and 2 kids. Every evening after dinner, I'd take our golden retriever, Max, for a walk around the neighborhood. It was our little routine, a chance for both of us to get some fresh air and exercise. Nothing exciting ever really happened on these walks. We'd stroll past the same houses, see the same neighbors out mowing their lawns or getting the mail. Max would do his business, I'd pick it up, and we'd head home. Just another boring slice of suburban life. That all changed about 2 months ago. It was a warm spring evening, and Max and I were out on our usual route. As we rounded the corner onto Oak Street, I noticed a teenage boy I hadn't seen before. He was maybe 16 or 17, with shaggy blonde hair. He was sitting on the curb, hunched over his phone. I didn't think much of it at first. New people moved into the neighborhood all the time. But as we got closer, the kid looked up and made eye contact with me. There was something unsettling about his gaze. It was cold and empty, like looking into the eyes of a shark. A chill ran down my spine. Max must have sensed something too, because he started growling softly. That was odd. Max was usually the friendliest dog you'd ever meet. He loved everyone. The boy stood up as we approached. "Hey there," he said with a small wave. "Cool dog." I nodded and gave a tight smile, tugging on Max's leash to keep him moving. "Thanks," I replied. Something about this kid just felt off, but I couldn't put my finger on why. "Mind if I pet him?" the boy asked, taking a step closer. Every instinct in my body was screaming at me to say no and keep walking, but I didn't want to be rude, and I figured I was just being paranoid. "Sure," I said reluctantly. "His name's Max." The boy crouched down and held out his hand for Max to sniff. Max's growl got a little louder, but he allowed the boy to pat his head. As he did, I noticed something dark caked under the boy's fingernails. At first I thought it was dirt, but it looked more like dried blood. My heart started pounding. I wanted to grab Max and run, but I was frozen in place. The boy stood back up and grinned at me. His teeth were unnaturally white and sharp-looking. "Thanks, mister," he said. "See you round." He sauntered off down the street, hands in his pockets. I watched him go, still rooted to the spot. It wasn't until he turned the corner that I snapped out of it and hurried home with Max. I tried to shake off the encounter, telling myself I was overreacting, but I couldn't get those dead eyes out of my head, or the blood under his nails. For the next few days, I found myself scanning the streets nervously during our walks, half expecting to see the blonde boy again. But I didn't see him. Life went on as normal. Work, family dinners, walking Max. The creepy encounter faded to the back of my mind. Then, about 3 weeks later, I was scrolling through the local news on my phone when a headline made my blood run cold. "Teen arrested for brutal murder of college student." I clicked on the article, my hands shaking. And there he was, that same blonde kid, staring at the camera with those empty shark eyes. The mugshot sent chills through my whole body. I read the article in horror. The victim was a 20-year-old woman who had gone missing 2 days earlier. Her dismembered body had been found in the woods outside of town, and this same kid who had pet my dog, had confessed to abducting her, torturing her for hours, and then cutting her into pieces while she was still alive. I felt like I was going to be sick. This monster had been right there in my neighborhood. He had touched my dog, talked to me, and at that very moment he'd probably already selected his victim and was planning her brutal murder. The article said he'd moved to the area recently to live with his aunt after getting kicked out of his parents' house. He'd been in town less than a month before committing the murder, which meant when I encountered him, he was already plotting his sick crime. I couldn't stop thinking about those little details I'd noticed. The blood under his nails, Max's uncharacteristic growling. How could I have been so stupid? I should have trusted my gut instinct that something was very wrong with that kid. For weeks afterwards, I was jumpy and paranoid. I started carrying pepper spray on our walks and eyeing every stranger suspiciously. My wife thought I was overreacting, but she hadn't seen those dead eyes up close like I had. I kept replaying that encounter in my mind, imagining all the horrible ways it could have gone differently. What if he had followed us home? What if he had decided to make me or my family his victims instead? The worst part was knowing that this sicko had been walking the same streets as us, probably watching and selecting targets. How many times had he passed by our house, looking for an opportunity? The thought made my skin crawl. I found myself obsessively reading every update on the case. Apparently the kid had been troubled for years, starting fires, torturing animals, that kind of thing. But his parents had always covered for him and gotten him out of trouble, until it escalated to murder. They found all kinds of disturbing evidence in his room at his aunt's house. Torture devices, stolen underwear from multiple women, even pieces of his victim's body that he'd kept as trophies. It was like something out of a horror movie. I couldn't help but wonder, had any of that stuff been in his pockets when he petted Max that day? Had he been carrying around human remains as he casually chatted with me on the street? The thought made me physically ill. As the case progressed, more chilling details came out. The kid had been planning his crime for weeks, meticulously stalking several potential victims before choosing the college student. He'd even done practice runs, breaking into houses at night while people slept just to prove he could. Had our house been one of his practice targets? Had he crept through our rooms while we slept, deciding whether or not to make us his victims? I installed a security system and started triple-checking that all our doors and windows were locked every night. The trial was a media circus. I couldn't bear to follow it too closely. The details of what he'd done to that poor girl were too horrific. He showed no remorse, just sat there with that empty, shark-eyed stare. They say he even smiled when they described the murder. He was convicted and sentenced to life in prison. Part of me wished they still had the death penalty in Virginia. Monsters like that don't deserve to keep breathing. Even now, months later, I still get chills thinking about that encounter, how close I came to pure evil that day. I'll never forget those eyes, the eyes of a remorseless killer who had probably been fantasizing about murder, even as he casually petted my dog. I'm more cautious now when I'm out with Max. I vary our route, stay alert, trust my instincts, because you never know when you might cross paths with a monster wearing a human face. I just thank God every day that my family and I weren't the ones who ended up as headlines in the local news. So, if you're out walking your dog and you get a bad feeling about someone, listen to it. Don't worry about being polite. Just get out of there. It might just save your life. My wife, I had just moved to Arizona with my daughter Emily, hoping for a fresh start after my divorce. We were driving back from a day trip exploring our new state, feeling excited about the adventure ahead. The sun was setting as we cruised down a long, empty stretch of highway, cutting through the desert. Emily was dozing in the passenger seat when I first noticed the headlights in my rearview mirror. At first I didn't think much of it, just another car on the road. But as the minutes ticked by, I realized the vehicle behind us was maintaining the exact same speed and distance. A prickle of unease crept up my spine. I tried to shake off the paranoid feeling. This was probably nothing. Still, I found myself gripping the steering wheel tighter, constantly checking the mirrors. The car behind us was close enough that I could make out the silhouette of the driver, a lone figure, but I couldn't see any details in the growing darkness. "Everything okay, Dad?" Emily mumbled, stirring from her nap. "Yeah, sweetie. Just keeping an eye on traffic," I replied, trying to keep my voice casual. I didn't want to alarm her if this turned out to be nothing, but my gut was screaming that something wasn't right. I decided to test my suspicion by slowing down slightly. The car behind us immediately matched my decrease in speed. My heart started to race. This wasn't a coincidence. I sped up, pushing 10 miles over the limit. The headlights stayed glued to my rear bumper. I went faster. They kept pace effortlessly. "Dad, why are we going so fast?" Emily asked, now fully awake and looking worried. Before I could answer, the car behind us suddenly accelerated, pulling up alongside us in the left lane. I caught a glimpse of a dark sedan with tinted windows. The driver was just a shadowy shape. Then they swerved sharply towards us. I yanked the wheel hard to the right, nearly running off the road as I shouted for Emily to hold on. She screamed as we fishtailed, kicking up a cloud of dust. I managed to straighten out, heart pounding. The other car had dropped back behind us again. "What's happening?" Emily cried, clutching the door handle. "I don't know, honey, but I need you to stay calm and put your seatbelt on, okay?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady, even as panic clawed at my chest. "Someone's following us. I'm going to try to lose them." I floored the gas pedal, the engine roaring as we shot forward. The speedometer crept past 90, then 100, but no matter how fast I went, those headlights stayed locked on us like a heat-seeking missile. I scanned desperately for any turnoffs or side roads, but there was nothing but empty desert on either side of the highway. We were totally exposed out here. My palms were sweating on the wheel as I weaved back and forth, trying to make us a harder target. The pursuer matched my every move. Any time I changed lanes, they were right there. If I slowed down, they'd creep up menacingly close before backing off again. It was like they were toying with us. Emily was sobbing quietly beside me. I wanted nothing more than to comfort her, but I couldn't take my eyes off the road for even a second. "It's going to be okay," I said, reaching over to squeeze her hand. "We're going to get out of this." But I had no idea how. We'd been driving for what felt like hours, though it was probably only 20 or 30 minutes. My gas gauge was getting dangerously low. I knew we couldn't keep this up much longer. Suddenly, an idea struck me. It was risky, but it might be our only shot. "Emily, listen to me very carefully," I said. "I'm going to try something to lose this guy. When I say so, I need you to turn off all the interior lights. Then I'm going to shut off our headlights for a few seconds. It's going to be pitch black, but I need you to trust me, okay?" She nodded, eyes wide with fear. I waited for a stretch of road with a slight curve ahead. "Okay now," I said. Emily quickly flipped off the dome light and dashboard illumination. I took a deep breath, said a silent prayer, and killed the headlights. We were plunged into total darkness. I could hear Emily whimpering beside me as I counted in my head. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi. On 3, I wrenched the wheel hard to the right. We bumped over rough terrain. I was driving blindly off the road into the desert. I kept going for another couple seconds before flicking the lights back on and immediately slamming on the brakes. We skidded to a stop in a cloud of dust. I twisted around, scanning the highway behind us. The other car's headlights swept past our hiding spot, continuing down the road. They hadn't seen us turn off. I sagged with relief, letting out a shaky breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. "We did it," I said. "I think we lost them." Emily threw her arms around me, sobbing. I hugged her tightly, my own eyes welling up as the adrenaline began to fade. We sat there for a long time, engine idling, both too shaken to move. Finally, I eased the car back onto the road, driving slowly and constantly checking my mirrors. But there was no sign of our pursuer. When we finally made it home, I triple-checked all the locks. Emily refused to sleep alone, so we camped out together in the living room. Neither of us got much rest that night. The next day, I reported the incident to the police. They took our statement, but without a license plate number or clear description of the vehicle, there wasn't much they could do. They promised to keep an eye out for similar reports. Weeks passed, and there were no further incidents. But the fear lingered. I installed a security system and always checked the driveway before going outside. Emily had nightmares and didn't want to go on any more road trips. To this day, I have no idea who was chasing us or why. Was it a case of mistaken identity, road rage gone too far, or something more sinister? I'll probably never know. All I know is that I'll never forget that night of terror on the lonely Arizona highway. It opened my eyes to how quickly our sense of safety can be shattered. I'm just grateful we made it out alive, and I hope whoever was behind those headlights never finds us again. I was just 14 when it happened. My best friend Emily and I were hanging out at Oakwood Park on a warm Saturday afternoon in our sleepy California town. It was the kind of day where the sun hung lazily in the sky, casting long shadows across the grass. We were sprawled out on a picnic blanket, giggling about cute boys in our class and sharing a bag of chips. The park was pretty quiet that day, just a few kids on the playground and some joggers on the path. Emily and I had been there for hours, enjoying the weather and each other's company. As the afternoon wore on, we decided to take a walk around the park to stretch our legs. We were strolling along, lost in conversation, when I got this weird prickly feeling on the back of my neck. You know that sensation when you feel like someone's watching you? It was like that, but more intense. I glanced over my shoulder and saw a man walking on the path behind us, maybe 50 feet back. He was tall and lanky, wearing jeans and a dark hoodie despite the warm weather. I nudged Emily. "Hey, do you see that guy back there?" I whispered. She looked back casually. "Yeah, what about him?" "I don't know. He's just giving me a weird vibe," I said. "Let's walk a little faster." We picked up our pace, and I tried to shake off the uneasy feeling. But a few minutes later, I looked back again. The man was still there, and he seemed to be getting closer. My heart started to race. "Em, I think that guy is following us," I hissed. She glanced back again, her eyes widening. "Oh my God, you're right. What do we do?" "Let's cut across the grass to the other side of the park," I suggested. "If he follows us, we'll know for sure." We veered off the path, our feet pounding across the grassy field. I resisted the urge to look back until we reached the other side. When I did, my blood ran cold. The man had also left the path and was walking purposefully in our direction. "He's still coming," I said, my voice shaking. "We need to get out of here." We started jogging along the park's perimeter, looking for the nearest exit. but the park was surrounded by a tall iron fence with only a few gates spaced far apart. "There's a gate up ahead," Emily panted. But as we got closer, I saw with horror that it was chained shut. "It's locked!" I cried. We spun around, frantically searching for another way out. The man was getting closer, maybe 100 feet away now. I could see his face clearly, pale, with dark, sunken eyes that seemed to bore right through me. "Over there," Emily pointed to a section of the fence next to a large oak tree. "We can climb it." We sprinted to the tree, clambering up its thick trunk. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the branches. We shimmied out onto a limb that hung over the fence. "Jump!" Emily yelled, launching herself off the branch. She landed on the other side with a thud. I hesitated for a split second, looking back at the man. He was running now, closing the distance fast. His face was contorted in a terrifying grin. Heart pounding, I leaped off the branch. I hit the ground hard, pain shooting up my ankle. But Emily grabbed my arm, yanking me to my feet. "Come on!" she screamed. We took off running down the sidewalk. I chanced a glance back and saw the man scaling the fence with disturbing agility. "He's coming!" I shrieked. We sprinted as fast as we could, but I could hear heavy footsteps pounding the pavement behind us. My lungs were burning, my injured ankle throbbing with each step. Up ahead, I saw the entrance to Willow Creek, the gated community where Emily's family lived. The guard booth was empty. They only staffed it at night. "The gate!" Emily gasped. "We can get in with my key fob." We raced toward the tall iron gates. Emily fumbled in her pocket for the key fob, nearly dropping it in her panic. She aimed it at the sensor and clicked frantically. Nothing happened. "It's not working," she cried, jabbing the button over and over. I looked back. The man was only about 30 feet behind us now, his face twisted in a predatory snarl. In desperation, I grabbed the gate and started to climb. The iron bars were slippery, and my sweaty hands kept losing their grip. Emily boosted me up from below. Just as I was swinging my leg over the top, I felt a hand grasp my ankle. I screamed, kicking wildly. My shoe flew off and I heard a grunt as it connected with something. I tumbled over the other side, landing in a heap on the pavement. Emily was already scaling the gate. I scrambled to my feet and helped pull her over. We collapsed on the ground, gasping for air. The man was at the gate now, gripping the bars and leering at us through the iron slats. He rattled the gate violently, but it held firm. Slowly, Emily and I backed away. The man's eyes followed our every move. Then, without a word, he turned and sprinted off down the street. We stood there trembling for several minutes, afraid he might come back. Finally, Emily broke the silence. "We need to call my uncle," she said shakily. "He lives a few blocks away." She pulled out her phone with quivering hands and called him. Within minutes, we heard the screech of tires as her uncle's pickup truck came barreling down the street. He jumped out, his face etched with concern. "Are you girls okay? What happened?" he demanded. We poured out the whole story, our words tumbling over each other. Emily's uncle listened gravely, his expression darkening. "Get in the truck," he said. "I'm taking you to the police station right now." As we drove, I kept replaying the chase in my mind. The man's creepy grin, the feeling of his hand on my ankle. It made me shudder. At the police station, we gave our statements. The officers seemed to take it seriously, especially when Emily's uncle backed us up. They sent out patrols to search for the man, but he was long gone. In the days that followed, I jumped at every shadow. I couldn't sleep without having nightmares about that twisted face peering through the gate. My parents hardly let me out of their sight. The police never found the man. Sometimes I wonder if he's still out there, waiting. I've never felt safe in that park again. Even now, years later, I can't shake the memory of those dark, hungry eyes watching me through the iron bars. That day in the park changed me forever. I learned that evil can lurk in even the most ordinary places, waiting to shatter the peace of a lazy summer afternoon. I was 13 when it happened. Just a normal summer day at the beach with my dog Max and my best friend Emily. We were walking along the shore, laughing and splashing in the waves. Max was running ahead, chasing seagulls and barking happily. The sun was starting to set, painting the sky in beautiful oranges and pinks. It should have been perfect, but then I noticed him, a tall man in a dark hoodie, walking some distance behind us. At first I didn't think much of it. Lots of people walk on the beach in the evening. But as we continued on, I realized he was matching our pace exactly, always staying about 50 feet behind us. "Em," I whispered, grabbing her arm. "Don't look now, but I think that guy is following us." Emily glanced back quickly. "Oh my God, you're right. What do we do?" My heart started racing. "Let's walk faster," I said. "Maybe he'll fall behind." We picked up our pace, practically jogging down the beach. Max sensed our unease and stayed close by my side. But when I looked back again, the man had sped up too. He was definitely following us. "We need to get out of here," Emily said, her voice shaking. "My mom is supposed to pick us up soon. Let's head to the parking lot." We veered away from the water, heading towards the dunes that separated the beach from the road. As soon as we changed direction, the man behind us did too. My stomach dropped. There was no doubt now, he was after us. We broke into a run, sprinting across the sand. Max barked and raced alongside us. I could hear heavy footsteps pounding behind us, getting closer and closer. "Help!" Emily screamed. "Somebody help us!" But the beach was mostly empty now as night fell. There was no one around to hear our cries. We reached the wooden walkway that led over the dunes to the parking lot. Emily's flip-flop caught on a board and she stumbled. I grabbed her arm to steady her, but those few seconds were enough for the man to gain on us. "Keep going!" I yelled, shoving Emily ahead of me. We raced up the steps, sand flying everywhere. At the top of the dune, I risked a glance back. The man was right behind us now, his face hidden in shadow under his hood. But I could see his mouth twisted in a horrible grin. "Got you now, little girls," he growled. Terror gave me an extra burst of speed as we flew down the other side of the dune. The parking lot was just ahead. If we could only make it there. Suddenly Max wheeled around and launched himself at the man, snarling and snapping. The man yelled in surprise and stumbled backwards. "Max, no!" I screamed. I wanted to go back for my brave dog, but Emily grabbed my hand and pulled me onwards. "There's my mom's car," she shouted. I saw headlights flashing in the dim lot. Emily's mom must have just pulled in to pick us up. We sprinted towards the car, waving our arms wildly. "Mom! Mom! Help!" Emily shrieked. The car door flew open, and Emily's mom jumped out, looking confused and alarmed. "Girls, what's wrong?" "There's a man chasing us," I gasped out between ragged breaths. Emily's mom's eyes widened in shock. She quickly ushered us into the back seat of the car and slammed the doors shut, locking them. "Where is he?" she demanded, peering into the darkness. I twisted around to look out the back window. The man had emerged from the dunes and was stalking across the parking lot towards us. Even from a distance, I could feel his predatory gaze fixed on me. My skin crawled. "There," I pointed. "The guy in the black hoodie." Emily's mom's face hardened. She jumped back in the driver's seat and started the engine. "Hang on, girls," she said grimly. She threw the car into reverse and peeled out of the parking spot, tires squealing. The man broke into a run, charging straight for us. For a heart-stopping moment, I thought he might reach us before we could get away. But Emily's mom whipped the car around and floored it. We shot out of the parking lot, the man's enraged shouts fading behind us. We sped down the coastal road, all of us shaking with leftover adrenaline. Emily was sobbing quietly. I felt numb with shock. "Are you girls all right?" Emily's mom asked, her voice tight with worry. "Did he hurt you?" No, I managed to stammer out. "We're okay. He didn't catch us." She let out a shuddering breath. "Thank God. I'm calling the police right now to report this." As she spoke rapidly to the 911 operator, describing the man and what had happened, reality started to sink in. We had nearly been abducted. If Emily's mom hadn't shown up when she did, I shuddered, not wanting to think about what might have happened. Suddenly I gasped, "Max! We left Max behind!" Fresh tears spilled down my cheeks as I thought of my loyal dog facing that evil man alone. What if he'd been hurt, or worse? "It's okay, sweetie," Emily's mom said soothingly. "The police will look for your dog too. I'm sure he's fine. That brave pup probably scared that creep away." I nodded, clinging to that hope. Max was smart and fast. Surely he'd gotten away. When we pulled up to my house, my parents were outside waiting. They must have gotten a call from Emily's mom. They rushed to the car and pulled me into a crushing hug. "Oh, honey, we were so worried," my mom cried. "Are you all right?" I burst into tears, the tension of the night finally overwhelming me. Between sobs, I managed to tell them what had happened. "You're safe now," my dad said firmly, his arm tight around my shoulders. "That bastard won't get anywhere near you again." The police arrived a few minutes later to take our statements. They assured us they would search the beach thoroughly for the man and for Max. I barely slept that night, jumping at every little sound. What if the man had somehow followed us home? What if he was outside my window right now? Logically, I knew I was safe, but I couldn't shake the fear. The next morning, there was still no sign of Max. My heart felt like it was breaking. He had saved us, and now he was gone. But just after lunch, we got a call from the police. They had found Max. He was a little scraped up, but otherwise perfectly fine. Apparently, he had chased the man quite a distance down the beach before losing him in the dunes. Then he had made his way to a beachfront restaurant where the staff recognized him from his collar and called it in. I've never been so happy and relieved in my life as when I saw Max bounding towards me, tail wagging. I hugged him tight, burying my face in his fur. "You're the best dog ever," I whispered. "My hero." The man was never caught. Sometimes I still have nightmares about his twisted grin and those footsteps pounding behind me. But mostly I try to focus on how lucky we were, how the quick actions of Emily's mom, the police, and my brave Max kept us safe. I'll never forget that night on the beach. It taught me that danger can come out of nowhere, even in familiar places. But it also showed me the power of quick thinking, teamwork, and having loved ones to protect you. I know I'll always be more cautious now, more aware of my surroundings, but I won't let fear rule my life. That man may have scared us, but in the end, we won. We escaped. And that's what I try to remember. I still remember that day like it was yesterday. The day I learned the hard way that some pranks can have serious consequences, even when you don't mean any real harm. It was just another boring Tuesday at Oak Ridge High. I was a sophomore then, sitting with my usual group of friends at lunch, picking at the mystery meat surprise and trying to figure out how to make the next 45 minutes remotely interesting. That's when I noticed Ash sitting alone a few tables over, hunched over his tray like always. Ash was different. He kept to himself, rarely spoke unless called on in class, and had a reputation for being kind of weird. There were all sorts of rumors about him, that he lived in a haunted house, that his parents were in some crazy cult, that he could see ghosts. Typical high school gossip. But the one thing everyone knew for sure was that Ash had this bizarre, intense phobia of vinegar. No one knew why, but even the slightest whiff of vinegar would send Ash into a full-blown panic attack. He'd go pale, start hyperventilating, the works. Of course, being the mature and empathetic teenagers we were, a lot of kids thought this was hilarious. There was always some jerk trying to sneak vinegar near Ash to get a reaction. I'd never participated in that kind of thing before, but on that day, something possessed me to do probably the dumbest thing I've ever done. I had a small spray bottle of vinegar in my backpack. Don't ask me why. I think it was for some science experiment. Without really thinking it through, I got this idea that it would be funny to give Ash a little scare. Nothing serious, just a quick spritz on his jacket when he wasn't looking. In my 15-year-old brain, I figured he'd jump a bit, maybe yelp, and we'd all have a good laugh. God, I was such an idiot. I waited until Ash got up to throw away his trash. As he walked past our table, I pulled out the spray bottle and gave his jacket a quick spritz. At first, nothing happened. Then, as the vinegar smell hit him, Ash froze mid-step. The color drained from his face, and his eyes went wide with terror. What happened next is burned into my memory forever. Ash let out this blood-curdling scream that made the entire cafeteria go dead silent. He started clawing at his jacket like it was covered in acid, desperately trying to get it off. Tears were streaming down his face as he gasped for air, making these awful choking sounds. It was like he couldn't breathe. Everyone was staring in shock. A teacher rushed over trying to calm Ash down, but he was beyond reaching. He violently shoved past the teacher and bolted out of the cafeteria, still screaming and pulling at his clothes. We could hear him all the way down the hall until the sound faded away. The cafeteria erupted into chaos. Teachers were yelling, trying to restore order. Kids were freaking out, some laughing nervously, others looking genuinely scared. I just sat there, frozen, the spray bottle still in my hand. I felt sick to my stomach as the reality of what I'd done sank in. Ash didn't come back to school for a week after that. When he finally returned, he looked like a shell of himself. Pale, jumpy, with dark circles under his eyes like he hadn't slept. He flinched at every sudden movement or loud noise. The rumor mill went into overdrive with all kinds of wild theories about what had happened and why Ash was so terrified of vinegar. Some said he'd been tortured with vinegar as a kid. Others claimed he had some rare medical condition that made vinegar toxic to him. A few of the more imaginative kids even suggested he was allergic to vinegar because he was actually some kind of vampire or demon. But no one really knew the truth, and Ash wasn't talking. I wanted to apologize, to explain that I never meant to hurt him like that. But every time I got near him, Ash would practically run away. The guilt was eating me alive. I couldn't sleep, couldn't focus in class. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Ash's face contorted in terror, heard that awful scream. About a month after the incident, I finally worked up the courage to approach Ash. I caught him alone after school, loading books into his locker. As soon as he saw me coming, he tensed up, looking ready to bolt. But I held up my hands, trying to show I meant no harm. "Ash, please," I said, my voice shaking. "I just want to apologize. What I did, it was horrible. I never meant to hurt you like that. I know it doesn't make it okay, but I'm so sorry." Ash stared at me for a long moment, his eyes guarded and wary. Then, to my surprise, he spoke. His voice was quiet, barely above a whisper. "You don't understand," he said. "None of you do. It's not just a smell to me. When I smell vinegar, I'm somewhere else, somewhere terrible. I can't explain it, but it's like I'm trapped in this nightmare I can't wake up from. And every time someone pulls a prank like that, they're sending me back there." I felt a chill run down my spine. There was something in Ash's eyes, a haunted look that made me believe every word. Whatever his experience with vinegar was, it went way beyond a simple phobia. "I'm sorry," I said again, feeling completely inadequate. "I had no idea. I swear I'll never do anything like that again, and I'll make sure no one else does either." Ash nodded slowly, then turned back to his locker. As he shut it and walked away, he paused for a moment. "Just remember," he said, not looking at me, "sometimes the things we think are harmless can have consequences we can't even imagine." With that, he was gone, leaving me standing there with a weight of guilt and a growing sense of unease. From that day on, I made it my mission to shut down any vinegar-related pranks or jokes aimed at Ash. Most kids backed off when they realized how serious it was, though there were always a few jerks who thought it was funny. Ash and I never became friends exactly, but there was a sort of unspoken understanding between us after that day. Sometimes I'd catch him looking at me with an expression I couldn't quite read. Gratitude mixed with something else, something almost like pity. As the years went by, the incident faded into high school legend. Ash graduated and moved away, and life went on. But I never forgot that day, or the lesson it taught me about the hidden depths of people's fears and experiences. Even now, years later, I can't smell vinegar without thinking of Ash and feeling a twinge of guilt and unease. Sometimes I wonder where he is now, if he ever overcame his phobia, or if he's still haunted by whatever trauma lay behind it. And sometimes, in my darker moments, I wonder if there wasn't something more to Ash's fear, something beyond normal explanation, something that tapped into terrors most of us can't even imagine. I'll never know for sure, but one thing's certain. I'll never look at a bottle of vinegar the same way again. And I'll always think twice before dismissing someone's fears as irrational or funny, because you never know what demons someone might be battling or what nightmares a simple prank might awaken. I was taking a quick study break, mindlessly scrolling through Facebook, when I got a notification, a friend request. Normally I'd just ignore it. I'm not one for adding random people. But the name caught my eye, Emily Thompson. My heart skipped a beat. Emily Thompson, that was the name of my half-sister, the sister I'd never met. Let me back up a bit. A few months earlier, I'd found out through some old family papers that my dad had another daughter from a previous relationship. It was a shock, to say the least. I'd always thought I was an only child. Finding out I had a half-sister out there somewhere, it was a lot to process. I'd been curious about her, of course, but I hadn't worked up the courage to try and find her yet. And now here she was, apparently finding me first. My hands were shaking as I clicked on the profile. The photos showed a girl who looked a bit like me. Same dark hair, same smile. It had to be her, right? Without thinking too much about it, I accepted the request. Almost immediately, a message popped up. "Hi, sis. I can't believe I finally found you. I've been looking for you for so long. I'm in LA too. Want to meet up?" I stared at the message, my heart racing. This was happening so fast. Part of me was excited. I'd always wondered what it would be like to have a sister, but another part of me was hesitant, It all seemed a bit convenient. I typed out a response. "Hi, Emily. Wow, this is unexpected. I'd love to meet up, but maybe we could chat a bit first." The reply came quickly. "Of course, but I'm actually in town just for today. There's this beautiful park I know, Elysian Park. How about we meet there in an hour? I can send you the exact location." I felt a knot forming in my stomach. Something about this didn't feel right. Elysian Park was huge, and parts of it were pretty isolated. Meeting a stranger there, even if she claimed to be my sister, it just seemed risky. I decided to stall. "Today's not great for me. How long are you in town? Maybe we could meet somewhere more central tomorrow." The response was immediate and pushy. "It has to be today. I'm flying out tonight. Please, I've waited so long for this. Just for an hour." That's when I knew something was definitely off. I didn't reply, but I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling. I tried to focus on my studies, but my mind kept drifting back to those messages. Later that evening, I was still feeling unsettled. I decided to do some digging. I reverse image searched the profile pictures, and my blood ran cold. They were stolen from some random girl's Instagram. This wasn't my sister at all. I felt sick. Who was this person, and what did they want? I couldn't stop thinking about what might have happened if I'd agreed to meet them. The location they'd sent me. I looked it up. It was in a remote corner of the park, known for gang activity. The realization of what I'd narrowly avoided hit me like a ton of bricks. I spent the next few days in a paranoid haze. I reported the fake profile to Facebook, but I couldn't shake the feeling that someone out there was targeting me specifically. How did they know about my sister? Was I being watched? I confided in my best friend, Jake. He's always been the level-headed one in our friendship. He listened to my story, his face growing more concerned by the minute. "We need to report this to the police," he said firmly. I nodded, but I felt helpless. What could the police really do? Jake came with me to the police station. The officer took our statement, but I could tell they didn't think much could be done. Fake profiles, unfortunately, weren't uncommon. They told me to be cautious and to report any further suspicious activity. I left feeling frustrated and scared. Jake, seeing my distress, suggested we do some investigating of our own. "If someone's using your sister's identity, maybe we can find the real her," he said. For the next week, we spent every free moment searching online. We scoured social media, public records, anything we could think of. It was like looking for a needle in a haystack. And then, late one night, we had a breakthrough. Jake found an Emily Thompson who lived in San Diego and worked as a teacher. The age matched up with what I knew about my half-sister. My hand was shaking as I drafted a message to her on LinkedIn. I kept it vague, not wanting to freak her out. I just said I believed we might be related and asked if we could talk. 2 days passed with no response. I was starting to lose hope when suddenly my phone pinged. A reply from Emily. She was cautious but curious. We exchanged a few messages and things started to add up. She knew my dad's name, details about his past that matched what I knew. This was her, my real half-sister. We agreed to video chat that weekend. I was a bundle of nerves as I waited for the call to connect. And then there she was, the real Emily. We talked for hours, sharing stories, laughing, crying. It was surreal and wonderful. A month later, Emily came to visit me in LA. We met in a busy coffee shop, no secluded parks this time. As soon as I saw her walk in, I knew it was really her. We hugged, both of us teary-eyed. We spent the day together wandering around the city, talking nonstop. It felt like making up for lost time. As we watched the sunset from the Santa Monica Pier, Emily turned to me with a serious look. "I'm so glad you reached out," she said, "but I have to ask, what made you decide to find me now?" I took a deep breath and told her everything about the fake profile, the close call, the fear and paranoia that followed. Her face paled as I spoke. "Oh my God," she whispered. "I had no idea. I'm so sorry you went through that." We hugged again, both of us shaken by the what-ifs, but as we pulled apart, we were smiling. Despite the scary start, something beautiful had come out of it. We'd found each other. It's been a few months since then. Emily and I talk regularly now, and she's coming to stay with me for a week next month. I'm still cautious online, and sometimes I still get a chill thinking about what could have happened. But mostly, I'm just grateful. Grateful for Jake's help. Grateful for my own instincts that kept me safe. And most of all, grateful for my newfound sister. I don't know who was behind that fake profile or what they wanted. Maybe I never will. But I do know that sometimes, even in the scariest situations, there can be a silver lining. I set out to find my sister, and instead, she found me. And that's a happy ending I never saw coming. I was just 16 when it happened. Looking back now, I can't believe how naive and carefree I was, walking alone to the corner store on a quiet Sunday afternoon. It was a route I'd taken hundreds of times before in our sleepy little town. Nothing bad ever happened here, or so I thought. The sun was shining, birds were chirping, and I had my headphones in, lost in my own little world as I strolled down the sidewalk. I barely registered the beat-up old van that pulled up slowly beside me. It wasn't until I felt a rough hand grab my arm that I snapped back to reality. My heart leapt into my throat as I spun around to see a large, scruffy-looking man leering at me. His grip on my arm tightened painfully as he started dragging me towards the open side door of the van. "Hey there, sweetheart. Why don't you come for a little ride with me?" he growled, his breath reeking of alcohol. Pure terror coursed through my body. This couldn't be happening. Not here, not to me. I opened my mouth to scream, but no sound came out. My legs felt like jelly as I tried to pull away, but he was so much stronger. Tears blurred my vision as the reality of what was happening hit me. This was it. I was about to be abducted in broad daylight, and no one was around to help me. Just as he was about to shove me into the van, a shrill voice pierced the air. "Hey, let go of her, you bastard!" I turned my head to see a disheveled woman running towards us, waving her arms wildly. She looked to be in her 50s, with unkempt gray hair and tattered clothes. As she got closer, I could see her sunken cheeks and rotting teeth, telltale signs of long-term drug use. But in that moment, she was my guardian angel. She started screaming at the top of her lungs, flailing her arms and making a huge scene. "Help! Police! This man is trying to kidnap this girl! Somebody help!" Her shrieking startled my would-be kidnapper. His grip on my arm loosened for just a split second, but it was enough. I wrenched myself free and stumbled backwards, nearly falling in my haste to get away. The woman placed herself between me and the man, continuing to yell and cause a commotion. I saw curtains twitching in nearby houses as people peered out to see what all the fuss was about. Realizing his plan had been foiled, the man dove back into his van and peeled away with a squeal of tires. I caught a glimpse of his face as he drove off. His eyes were wild with anger and frustration. The image is seared into my memory to this day. I collapsed onto the sidewalk, my legs giving out as the adrenaline drained from my body. I was shaking uncontrollably, gasping for air between sobs. The woman knelt down beside me, her weathered face etched with concern. "It's okay, honey. He's gone now. You're safe," she said softly, awkwardly patting my shoulder. I looked up at her through my tears, overcome with gratitude. Thank you," I stammered. "You saved me." She gave me a small, sad smile. "I'm just glad I was here, sweetie. No one deserves to go through something like that." As the shock started to wear off, I became aware of a small crowd gathering around us. Someone had called the police, and soon I heard sirens in the distance. The woman fidgeted nervously, clearly uncomfortable with all the attention. "I should go," she mumbled, starting to stand up. I grabbed her hand. "Wait, please don't leave. I need to thank you properly. What's your name?" She hesitated, then said quietly, "Margaret, but everyone calls me Maggie." "Thank you, Maggie. I'm Emily. You're a hero." She shook her head. "I'm no hero, honey. Just did what anyone would do." But I knew that wasn't true. How many people would have put themselves at risk like that for a stranger? Especially someone who clearly had her own struggles to deal with. The police arrived and I had to give a statement. By the time I looked around for Maggie again, she had vanished. I felt a pang of regret that I hadn't been able to do more to thank her. The next few weeks were a blur of police interviews, trauma counseling, and hovering parents who suddenly didn't want to let me out of their sight. The man was never caught, which left me jumping at shadows for months afterwards. But as time passed, life slowly returned to normal. I graduated high school, went off to college, and tried my best to put that terrifying day behind me. Yet I never forgot Maggie and her act of bravery. I often wondered what had become of her. It wasn't until nearly 10 years later that our paths crossed again. I had moved back to my hometown after college and was working as a social worker at a local rehab facility. One day, a new patient was brought in, a woman in her 60s, rail-thin and haggard, but with kind eyes that seemed vaguely familiar. It took me a moment to place her, but when she said her name was Margaret, it all came rushing back. My hand shook as I went through her intake forms, my mind reeling at this twist of fate. When we were alone, I took a deep breath and said, "Maggie, I don't know if you remember me, but my name is Emily. 10 years ago, you saved me from being kidnapped." Her eyes widened in recognition. "Emily? Little Emily from Pine Street? My God, look at you all grown up." Tears welled up in my eyes. "I never got to properly thank you for what you did that day. You saved my life." Maggie looked down, embarrassed. It was nothing. I'm just glad you're okay." "It wasn't nothing," I insisted. "It was everything. And now it's my turn to help you." Over the next few months, I worked closely with Maggie as she went through rehab. It wasn't easy. She had been an addict for over 30 years and had burned a lot of bridges. But she was determined to get clean, and I was determined to help her succeed. Slowly but surely, Maggie started to transform. As the drugs left her system, it was like watching her come back to life. Her skin cleared up, she gained some healthy weight, and her eyes regained their sparkle. She opened up to me about her past, how she'd gotten hooked on drugs as a teenager and spent decades in a haze of addiction, burning through relationships and jobs. "I have grandkids, you know," she told me one day during a counseling session. 3 of them, never even met them. My daughter won't let me near them, and I don't blame her one bit. I could see the pain and regret in her eyes. It became my mission to not only help Maggie get clean, but to help her rebuild her life and reconnect with her family. It took time and a lot of hard work, but eventually Maggie completed the program. I helped her find a job and a small apartment. Slowly, she started to mend fences with her daughter. It wasn't easy, and there were plenty of setbacks along the way, but Maggie's determination never wavered. The day Maggie got to meet her grandchildren for the first time, I was there. Watching her hold her youngest granddaughter, tears streaming down her face, was one of the most beautiful things I've ever seen. In that moment, I knew that everything had come full circle. Maggie had saved me all those years ago, and now I'd been able to help save her in return. Today, Maggie has been clean for 5 years. She has a good relationship with her daughter and is a doting grandmother. We still meet up for coffee regularly, marveling at how our lives have intersected in such profound ways. Sometimes I think about how close I came to being abducted that day, how different my life would be if Maggie hadn't intervened. And sometimes I think about how close Maggie came to dying alone on the streets if our paths hadn't crossed again at just the right moment. It's a powerful reminder that a single act of kindness can change the course of someone's life forever. Maggie and I saved each other in different ways and at different times. Our story isn't over. It's a lifelong bond forged in a moment of crisis and strengthened through years of mutual support and love. I'll never forget that terrifying day when I was 16. But now, when I think back on it, I don't focus on the fear. Instead, I remember the brave woman who risked everything to help a stranger. And I'm filled with gratitude for the unlikely friendship that bloomed from one of the worst moments of my life. I was so excited for the weekend-long LARP event in the woods. I'd been planning my character and costume for months, a badass elven ranger named Elindra. As I drove up to the campground on Friday afternoon, I couldn't wait to immerse myself in 3 days of fantasy role-playing. The first few hours were amazing. I met my fellow adventurers, got into character, and started exploring the beautifully decorated campsite that had been transformed into a medieval fantasy village. But then I encountered Greg. He came up to me while I was chatting with some other players by the tavern tent. At first he seemed nice enough, complimenting my costume and asking about my character. But there was something a bit off about the intensity of his gaze. He stood just a little too close, laughed a bit too loudly at my jokes. I tried to politely extricate myself from the conversation, but Greg kept finding excuses to talk to me. He'd pop up whenever I was alone, always with some flimsy pretense. "Oh, Elindra, I found these herbs in the forest. Your ranger skills could probably identify them." Or, "Hey, I heard a rumor about treasure in the caves to the north. Want to go check it out? Just the two of us?" I kept brushing him off, but he wasn't taking the hint. As the day went on, his behavior got more and more unsettling. I'd catch him staring at me from across the campsite. Once when I went to use the porta-potties, he was waiting right outside when I came out. He tried to guide me into the woods, saying he had a special quest for me. I was getting seriously creeped out. That night, I confided in my friends about Greg's behavior. They agreed to keep an eye out and stick close to me. I felt a bit better knowing I had backup, but I was still on edge. The next morning, I woke up early and decided to take a quiet walk through the misty woods to clear my head before the day's quests began. Big mistake. I was about 10 minutes down the trail when I heard twigs snapping behind me. I turned to see Greg emerging from the trees, blocking the path back to camp. "Elindra, what a coincidence running into you out here," he said with a wide grin that didn't reach his eyes. My heart started racing. "Oh, hi, Greg. I was just heading back to camp, actually." I tried to step around him, but he moved to block my path. "Why the rush? I thought we could spend some quality time together. Just us two brave adventurers." He took a step closer. I could smell stale beer on his breath. "Thanks, but I really need to get back," I said firmly. trying to keep the tremor out of my voice. My group is waiting for me. Greg's smile vanished. Always running off with your little friends. Why won't you give me a chance? I could show you things they never could. He reached out to grab my arm. I jerked away and stumbled backwards. Don't touch me, I yelled. Leave me alone. I turned and ran deeper into the woods, heart pounding. I could hear Greg crashing through the underbrush behind me. Come back, I just want to talk. I ran until my lungs were burning, zigging and zagging between the trees. Finally, I couldn't hear him anymore. I crouched behind a fallen log, trying to catch my breath and get my bearings. The morning mist made it hard to see far in any direction. I had no idea where I was in relation to the camp. After a few minutes of tense silence, I heard Greg's voice in the distance. Lindra, where are you? Don't be scared, I'm not going to hurt you. I just want us to be together. I stayed frozen in place, hardly daring to breathe. His voice got closer, then farther, then closer again, as he wandered the woods searching for me. At one point, he passed within 20 feet of my hiding spot. I could see his legs through the undergrowth. I clamped a hand over my mouth to stifle a whimper. Finally, his voice faded away. I waited another 10 minutes to be sure, then cautiously stood up. I was completely turned around, unsure which direction would take me back to camp. I picked a direction that seemed right and started walking, straining my ears for any sound of pursuit. After about 30 minutes of nervous hiking, I finally spotted the colorful tents of the camp through the trees. I nearly cried with relief. I hurried back to my friends and told them what happened. They were furious and immediately went to report Greg to the event organizers. I spent the rest of the day sticking close to my group, constantly looking over my shoulder. Greg seemed to have disappeared. The organizers couldn't find him anywhere. I started to relax a bit as the afternoon wore on. That night we gathered around the bonfire for the nightly feast and storytelling. I was sitting with my friends, laughing at a bard's comedic ballad, when I felt a hand on my shoulder. I whirled around to see Greg leering down at me. There you are, my elusive ranger, he slurred. He reeked of alcohol. How about we go somewhere private to discuss that quest? Before I could react, my friend Mark jumped up and shoved Greg back. Back off, creep. She doesn't want anything to do with you. Greg's face contorted with rage. He lunged at Mark, swinging wildly. Other players rushed to intervene as they grappled. Security guards converged on the scene and forcibly dragged Greg away as he shouted obscenities. The event organizers apologized profusely and assured me Greg had been permanently banned. They offered to escort me to my car if I wanted to leave early. But I was determined not to let one creep ruin the weekend I'd been looking forward to for so long. I stuck it out for the final day, but I couldn't fully relax and get back into character. I kept imagining I saw Greg's face in the shadows between the trees. Every twig snap made me jump. When it was finally time to pack up and head home, I felt equal parts relief and lingering unease. I kept checking my rearview mirror on the drive home, half expecting to see Greg's car following me. It's been a few weeks now, and I'm still processing everything that happened. I get anxious walking alone in the woods now. I've been researching self-defense classes. Part of me wants to attend another LARP event to reclaim that sense of fun and excitement. But another part of me is terrified of running into Greg again, or someone like him. I know the organizers banned him, but what if he shows up anyway? What if he's been obsessing over me this whole time, planning some kind of revenge? What if he found out my real name somehow and is stalking me in the real world? I try to tell myself I'm being paranoid. Greg was just a sad, lonely guy who didn't know how to interact with women. He's probably moved on and forgotten all about me by now. But late at night, when every little sound makes me jump. It's hard to believe that. I don't know if I'll ever feel truly safe at a LARP event again. The magic of escaping into a fantasy world has been tainted. Now I know that real-world dangers can follow you even into made-up realms. I just hope that sharing my story might help other women be more aware and cautious. Trust your instincts, stick with your friends, and don't be afraid to report creepy behavior. No one should have to go through what I did. It was around 10:30 p.m. when I first heard the noises. At first I thought it was just the usual creaks and groans of our old building settling. But then I heard what sounded like muffled voices and heavy footsteps coming from next door. My neighbor Ben usually kept to himself and was rarely up this late. A chill ran down my spine as I realized something wasn't right. I muted the TV and strained my ears, trying to make out what was happening. There was a loud thud, followed by more shuffling and hushed, urgent-sounding voices. My heart started racing as my mind conjured up worst-case scenarios. Should I call the police? What if I was overreacting and it was just Ben having some friends over? I didn't want to cause a scene over nothing, but deep down, I knew this wasn't normal. I crept over to the wall we shared with Ben's unit and pressed my ear against it. The voices were clearer now. At least 3 distinct male voices that I didn't recognize. They were speaking in hushed but forceful tones. I caught fragments like, "Where is it?" and "Check upstairs." My blood ran cold. This had to be a break-in. I should call 911 right now. But as I reached for my phone with trembling hands, I hesitated. What if they heard me on the phone and realized I was home? Would they come for me and Amy next? Panic gripped me as I stood frozen, unsure what to do. I thought about grabbing Amy and making a run for it, but what if they saw or heard us leaving? We'd be totally exposed. I decided the safest thing was to stay put and keep quiet. I turned off all the lights and crept up to Amy's room. She was still sound asleep, oblivious to the nightmare unfolding next door. I gently closed her door and positioned myself in the hallway where I could keep an eye on both her room and the front door. For the next hour, I sat there in terrified silence, straining to hear what was happening next door. The noises continued, drawers opening and closing, more thuds and shuffling. At one point I heard a muffled cry that made my stomach lurch. Was that Ben? What were they doing to him? I kept telling myself I should call the police, but by now so much time had passed. What if they left before the cops arrived and then came back for revenge later? What if they realized I had heard everything and decided to eliminate any witnesses? My mind raced through awful scenarios as I sat paralyzed with indecision and fear. I've never felt so helpless and afraid in my life. Every creak of the floorboards made me flinch. I was terrified they would realize I was home and come crashing through the door at any moment. After what felt like an eternity, I heard a door slam and then the sound of a car starting up and driving away. The silence that followed was deafening. I stayed frozen in place for at least another hour, afraid to move a muscle. When sunlight finally started peeking through the windows, I crept downstairs on shaky legs. I peered out the front window but didn't see anything unusual. No sign of police or any commotion next door. I spent the morning in a haze of fear and exhaustion, jumping at every little sound. I kept Amy home from school, making up an excuse about her not feeling well. I couldn't bear to let her out of my sight. Around midday, there was a knock at the door that nearly gave me a heart attack. I approached cautiously and looked through the peephole. It was Ben. I opened the door with trembling hands. Ben looked awful. His face was bruised and swollen, and he had cuts on his arms, but he managed a weak smile when he saw me. "Hey, I just wanted to check if you're okay," he said hoarsely. Did you hear anything last night? I nodded, feeling a rush of guilt. I'm so sorry, Ben. I heard noises, but I didn't know what to do. I was too scared to call the police. Are you all right? What happened? Ben sighed heavily. 3 guys broke in around 10:30. They tied me up and ransacked the place, looking for cash and valuables. Left me tied up all night until I managed to get free this morning. I'm just glad they didn't realize you were home too. Who knows what they might have done? I felt sick to my stomach. I'm so sorry. I should have called for help. Ben shook his head. No, you did the right thing staying quiet. These guys were dangerous. If they had known you were home and heard everything. He trailed off, but I understood the implication. We talked for a bit longer. Ben had already filed a police report. They took his TV, laptop, and some cash and jewelry. But he was just glad to be alive. As he turned to leave, Ben paused. Listen, I know this is a lot to process. If you need anything or just want to talk, I'm here. We have to look out for each other, you know? I nodded, fighting back tears. After he left, I finally broke down sobbing. The fear, guilt, and sheer relief of making it through the night alive came crashing down on me all at once. In the days and weeks that followed, I struggled to feel safe in my own home. I installed new locks and an alarm system. I barely slept, staying up most nights listening for any unusual sounds. Every little noise made me jump. Ben and I grew closer after the incident. We'd check in on each other regularly and keep an eye out for anything suspicious. But it was hard to shake the feeling of vulnerability, knowing how easily our sense of security had been shattered. I've replayed that night in my head countless times, wondering if I should have done things differently. The guilt of not calling for help still gnaws at me. But then I look at Amy, sleeping peacefully in her bed, and I'm overwhelmed with gratitude that we made it through unharmed. I know rationally that we're probably safer now with all the extra precautions. The police increased patrols in the neighborhood, and nothing like that has happened since. But some part of me remains on high alert, never quite able to relax fully. That night changed me in ways I'm still trying to understand. It opened my eyes to how fragile our sense of safety can be, how quickly everything can change. I hug Amy a little tighter now, cherishing every moment with her. And I've learned that sometimes the bravest thing you can do is stay quiet and survive. I still wonder about those men sometimes. Who were they? Did they target Ben specifically, or was it random? Are they still out there, breaking into other homes and terrorizing families? The not knowing is almost worse than anything else. But life goes on. Amy and I still live in the same townhouse. I've thought about moving, but this is our home. I refuse to let fear drive us away. Instead, I'm focusing on building a strong support network in the neighborhood. We look out for each other now in a way we never did before. Sometimes at night, when the house is quiet and still, I find myself straining to hear any unusual sounds from next door. But now, instead of paralyzing fear, I feel a grim determination. I know now that I would do whatever it takes to protect my daughter and my home. Those men may have taken our sense of security that night, but they didn't break our spirit. And so we carry on, a little more cautious perhaps, but also more resilient. Because in the end, that's all we can do. Face our fears, support each other, and keep moving forward, one day at a time. The movie was some forgettable action flick, but I was enjoying it well enough as I munched on my pepperoni pizza. About halfway through, nature called. I paused the movie on my phone and stepped out of the car to take a quick leak in the trees. The night was still and quiet, just the soft rustle of leaves in the gentle breeze. As I was finishing up, I heard a twig snap somewhere in the darkness behind me. I froze, suddenly very aware of how alone and exposed I was out here. My heart started racing as I quickly zipped up and spun around, eyes straining to see anything in the shadows between the trees. For a few long seconds, there was nothing. Then I caught a flicker of movement, something pale darting between two trunks about 20 feet away. I sucked in a sharp breath, the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. "Hello?" I called out, hating how my voice quavered. "Is someone there?" No response, just more rustling. Whatever it was seemed to be circling around towards my car. Panic rising in my chest, I started backing up, fumbling for my keys. Just as I reached the driver's side door, a figure burst out of the tree line. I let out an embarrassingly high-pitched yelp of terror. Standing there, illuminated in my headlights, was a man, a very naked, very filthy man. He was rail-thin, ribs clearly visible under skin caked with mud and leaves. Wild, matted hair hung down past his shoulders, but what struck me most were his eyes, wide and feral, darting around frantically. For a moment we just stared at each other, both seemingly frozen in shock. Then his gaze fixed on something behind me. Before I could react, he lunged forward with surprising speed. I flinched back, certain he was attacking me, but instead he dove past me through the open passenger window. By the time I spun around, he was already scrambling back out, my half-eaten pizza clutched to his chest. Without a word, he took off sprinting back towards the woods, stringy hair flying behind him. I stood there dumbfounded, mouth hanging open as I watched this spectral figure disappear into the darkness with my dinner. The whole encounter had lasted maybe 15 seconds. Part of me wondered if I had dozed off and dreamed the whole thing. But the empty pizza box on my passenger seat confirmed it was all too real. Shaken, I quickly got back in my car and locked the doors, my appetite thoroughly ruined. I tried to calm my racing heart as I processed what the hell had just happened. Who was that guy? How long had he been out here? Was he dangerous? As the initial shock faded, concern started to creep in. Clearly, this man needed help. He looked half-starved and clearly wasn't in his right mind. Should I call the police? But what would I even tell them? I got my pizza stolen by a naked forest hobo. They'd probably think I was the crazy one. I sat there debating what to do for a good 20 minutes. In the end, my self-preservation instinct won out over any altruistic impulses. This guy was clearly unstable, and I didn't want to risk another encounter. I started up my car and got the hell out of there, tires kicking up dust as I sped down the dirt road. On the drive home, I kept obsessively checking my mirrors, irrationally worried the forest man was somehow going to appear in my back seat. Every shadow on the side of the road made me flinch. I breathed a huge sigh of relief when I finally made it back to the relative safety of my apartment. Sleep did not come easy that night. I tossed and turned, my mind conjuring up increasingly outlandish theories about the identity of my pizza thief. Was he some kind of feral human raised by wolves? An escaped mental patient? The victim of some horrible crime who had been living in the woods? By morning, the dark circles under my eyes rivaled those of the wild man himself. I spent the next day in a fog, unable to focus on anything. I kept replaying the encounter over and over, questioning if I had really seen what I thought I saw. Maybe I was working too hard lately. Maybe I needed a vacation. Maybe I was losing my damn mind. That evening, morbid curiosity got the better of me. I had to go back. I had to know if it was real or if I had imagined the whole thing. So I drove out to that same spot again, this time leaving my pizza safely at home. As I pulled up to the clearing, my headlights swept across something that made my blood run cold. There, at the edge of the trees, was a crude shelter made of branches and leaves. And hanging from one of the supports was a familiar cardboard box, my empty pizza box from the night before. I didn't even turn off the engine. I threw the car into reverse and got out of there as fast as I could, my tires squealing. I didn't slow down until I was safely back on the main road, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. Since then, I've avoided that part of the woods entirely. I've thought about reporting it to someone, but I still don't know what I'd say. Who would believe me? Sometimes I wonder if I really saw what I think I saw. But then I remember those wild eyes staring at me from that gaunt, dirty face. The primal fear I felt in that moment. The ridiculous sight of a grown man sprinting naked through the woods with a pizza clutched to his chest. It's been months now, but I still find myself scanning the tree line whenever I'm driving at night. I can't help but wonder, is he still out there? Has he found help? Or is he huddled in that crude shelter, waiting for his next unsuspecting victim to stop by for a late-night snack? I guess I'll never know for sure. But one thing's for certain. I won't be having any more pizza picnics in secluded forest clearings. Some mysteries are better left unsolved, and some pizzas are better left uneaten. I was just a normal college student, trying to focus on my studies and enjoy campus life. But everything changed when I noticed him watching me. At first, I brushed it off as coincidence. Seeing the same face around campus wasn't that unusual. But as the weeks went by, I started to get an uneasy feeling in the pit of my stomach. His name was Jake, and he worked in the athletic department. I'd see him lingering outside my classes, pretending to be on his phone, but clearly waiting for me to exit. He'd show up at the campus coffee shop when I was there studying. Once, I even spotted him across the street from my off-campus apartment, just standing there staring up at my window. I tried to ignore it, telling myself I was being paranoid. But then, I started noticing little things that sent chills down my spine. My roommate mentioned seeing a guy matching Jake's description hanging around our building late at night. A classmate asked if the athletic department guy was my boyfriend, since she always saw him nearby. The final straw came when I was out with friends at a local bar. I went to the bathroom, and when I came back, my drink tasted off. I immediately felt dizzy and nauseous. My friends got me home safely, but I was terrified at what could have happened. The next day, I found a blurry photo of myself at the bar slipped under my apartment door. On the back was a creepy note, "You should be more careful." That's when I knew I had to do something. I went to campus security and filed a report detailing all of Jake's behavior. They seemed concerned and said they'd look into it, but days went by with no action. When I followed up, they said there wasn't enough evidence of an actual crime. Frustrated and scared, I went to the local police. The officer I spoke to was sympathetic, but explained that without concrete proof of threats or physical harm, there wasn't much they could do legally. Jake was being careful to skirt the edges of the law. I felt utterly helpless. Everywhere I went, I felt eyes on me. I started seeing Jake's face in crowds, jumping at every sound. My grades started slipping as I struggled to focus in class, constantly looking over my shoulder. I stopped going out with friends, too afraid to be in public. My whole world was shrinking. One night, I woke up to the sound of someone trying to open my bedroom window. Heart pounding, I called 911. By the time police arrived, there was no one there. But I found muddy footprints outside and scratch marks on the window frame. The officers took a report, but again said there wasn't enough to go on. I was at my breaking point. I considered dropping out of school, moving back home. But I didn't want to let Jake win, to let him ruin my life. So I decided to fight back in my own way. I started meticulously documenting every incident, no matter how small. I set up security cameras around my apartment. I varied my routines, never taking the same route to class twice. I took self-defense classes and started carrying pepper spray. I also reached out to other students, especially women, warning them about Jake. Soon I discovered I wasn't his only target. Other women came forward with similar stories. We formed a support group, watching out for each other and sharing information. As our group grew, we put pressure on the university administration. We held rallies, wrote letters, and demanded action. Finally, the school launched an official investigation into Jake's behavior. It wasn't an immediate fix. Jake seemed to go to ground for a while, and I had moments of paranoia where I was sure he was still watching from the shadows. But slowly, life started to feel normal again. I could walk across campus without constantly looking over my shoulder. Months went by without incident. I started to breathe easier, to feel like myself again. But I never let my guard down completely. Then, on the day of my graduation, I spotted a familiar face in the crowd. Jake was there, watching from a distance. Our eyes met for a brief moment, and I felt that old fear grip my heart. But this time I stood my ground. I stared right back at him, refusing to look away. After a tense moment, Jake turned and disappeared into the crowd. I haven't seen him since that day, but sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I still get the feeling of being watched. I don't know if it's lingering paranoia or if Jake is still out there, biding his time. What I do know is that I'm stronger now. I survived his torment, and I won't let fear control my life. I'm sharing my story in hopes that it might help someone else who's going through something similar. To anyone out there dealing with a stalker, you're not alone, and it's not your fault. Don't give up. Keep fighting. Keep speaking out. Your voice matters. I still have nightmares sometimes, reliving those terrifying months. I see Jake's face in the shadows, feel phantom eyes on me in crowded places. But I refuse to let those fears define me. I've moved to a new city, started a career I love. I'm rebuilding my life one day at a time. But I'll never forget what happened. How quickly my sense of safety was shattered. How helpless I felt in the face of a system that seemed designed to protect predators rather than victims. It's changed how I move through the world, always a little more cautious, a little more aware. I hope that by sharing my story, I can help raise awareness about stalking and the need for better laws and support systems. No one should have to live in fear like I did. If you're reading this and relating to my experience, please know that you're not alone. Reach out for help, document everything, and don't give up. Your safety and peace of mind are worth fighting for. To this day, I don't know what drove Jake to fixate on me, or if he's found a new target, but I refuse to let the lingering uncertainty control my life. I'm reclaiming my story, my space, my sense of self. It's an ongoing process, but I'm getting stronger every day. And to Jake, or anyone like him who might be reading this, we won't be silenced. We won't live in fear. Your days of operating in the shadows are numbered. As I turned onto Oak Street, I noticed a woman walking on the opposite side of the road. She was dressed oddly for the mild weather, a long dark coat and a wide-brimmed hat that obscured most of her face. A small backpack was slung over her shoulder. I didn't think much of it at first, but as I continued down the street, I realized she had crossed over to my side and was now walking behind me. I picked up my pace slightly, chalking up my unease to an overactive imagination. But when I glanced back again after a block, she was still there, matching my increased speed. My heart started to beat faster as I realized this probably wasn't a coincidence. Trying to stay calm, I made a sharp right turn onto Elm Street, hoping to lose her. But within seconds, I heard the click of her heels rounding the corner behind me. Now I was certain. She was following me deliberately. My mind raced, trying to figure out what to do. Should I confront her? Try to lose her? Call the police? I didn't want to overreact, but something about this woman's persistent pursuit and strange appearance set off all my internal alarms. I quickened my pace to a brisk walk, almost a jog, but her footsteps kept pace behind me. Block after block, turn after turn, she stayed right on my tail. My nerves were completely frayed at this point. What did she want? Was she planning to mug me? Worse. After about 10 minutes of this terrifying cat-and-mouse game, I decided I had to do something. I couldn't keep running forever, and I was getting further from the busier parts of town where I might find help. Taking a deep breath, I spun around to face her. "Why are you following me?" I demanded, trying to keep my voice steady despite my racing pulse. She stopped abruptly about 15 feet away. In the dim streetlight, I could finally see her face clearly. She was pale, with sunken cheeks and dark circles under her eyes. But what struck me most was her expression, utterly blank, devoid of any emotion. For several agonizing seconds, she just stared at me. Then, slowly, she reached for her backpack. My muscles tensed, ready to run or fight. Was she grabbing a weapon? But instead of pulling something out, she simply adjusted the strap on her shoulder. Then, without a word, she turned and walked away in the opposite direction. I stood there dumbfounded, watching her retreating figure. Part of me wanted to chase after her and demand answers. But my instinct for self-preservation won out, and I turned and ran home as fast as I could. Once safely inside with the doors locked, I tried to make sense of what had just happened. Had I narrowly escaped some kind of attack? Was she mentally ill? Or was there some other explanation I couldn't fathom? I barely slept that night, jumping at every little sound. The next day, I scoured local news sites for any reports of crimes or strange occurrences, but found nothing. I even considered reporting it to the police, but what would I say? That a woman walked behind me? For weeks afterwards, I was on edge every time I went out at night. I varied my walking routes and kept looking over my shoulder, but I never saw the strange woman again. Months have passed now, and the incident has faded into a surreal, half-remembered nightmare. But I still can't shake the feeling that I narrowly avoided something terrible that night. Sometimes when I'm out walking, I'll catch a glimpse of a figure in a long coat out of the corner of my eye, and my heart will skip a beat before I realize it's just an ordinary pedestrian. I've racked my brain trying to come up with a rational explanation for the woman's behavior. Was she confused and thought I was someone else? Was she playing some kind of twisted game? Or was she genuinely planning to harm me only to lose her nerve at the last moment? I'll probably never know the truth, but one thing's for certain. I'll never take my sense of safety for granted again. That night showed me how quickly an ordinary moment can turn into something terrifying and inexplicable. It's a reminder that even in familiar surroundings, we're sometimes closer to the unknown than we realize. These days, I still go for walks to clear my head, but I'm always hyper-aware of my surroundings, and I never go out without my phone fully charged. And on nights when the streets are empty and the shadows seem a little too dark, I can't help but wonder, is she still out there somewhere, waiting for her next target? The incident has changed me in ways I'm still coming to terms with. I find myself studying the faces of passers-by more closely, wondering what secrets or intentions might be hiding behind their expressions. I've become more cautious about my routines, varying my routes and times to be less predictable. Sometimes I wonder if I overreacted that night. Maybe there was an innocent explanation for the woman's behavior that I was too panicked to see. But then I remember the blank look in her eyes, the deliberate way she followed my every move, and the chill comes right back. I've tried talking to friends about it, but it's hard to convey the visceral fear I felt in that moment. Most people just tell me I have an overactive imagination or joke that I've been watching too many thriller movies. But they weren't there. They didn't feel the growing dread as this stranger stalked me through the darkened streets. One thing that particularly haunts me is the question of what would have happened if I hadn't confronted her. Would she have continued following me indefinitely? Would she have eventually made some kind of move? Or would she have just faded away into the night, leaving me to wonder forever? I've become somewhat obsessed with trying to find answers. I've scoured online forums for similar stories, read up on stalking behaviors, even consulted with a criminal psychologist friend of mine. But nothing quite fits the bizarre specifics of my experience. The backpack is another detail that nags at me. What was in it? Why did she adjust it at that crucial moment instead of grabbing something from inside? Was it just a nervous gesture, or was she sending some kind of message? Sometimes I think I see her in crowds, a glimpse of a wide-brimmed hat, the swish of a long coat. My heart races every time, but it's never actually her. At least I don't think it is. Part of me almost wishes I would see her again, just to prove to myself that it really happened and I'm not going crazy. I've started carrying pepper spray, taking self-defense classes, installing extra security measures at home. Rationally, I know the chances of running into her again are slim. But that night showed me how quickly rationality can go out the window when you're faced with the inexplicable. There are nights when I lie awake, replaying every detail of the encounter in my mind. Could I have handled it differently? Should I have called for help earlier? What if I had just kept running instead of confronting her? The what-ifs are endless and maddening. I've thought about moving to a new neighborhood, or even a new city. But I know that wherever I go, the memory of that night will follow me. It's not just about that specific woman anymore. It's about the realization that the familiar can become terrifyingly unfamiliar in an instant. So, I stay, and I cope. I found some solace in connecting with others who've had strange, unexplainable encounters. It helps to know I'm not alone in grappling with something that defies easy explanation. But still, on quiet nights when the wind whispers through the trees and shadows play tricks on the eye, I can't help but wonder, is she out there? And more chillingly, are there others like her, silently stalking the unsuspecting through darkened streets for reasons we may never understand? The incident has become a dividing line in my life, before that night and after. I'm more cautious now, more aware of the fragility of safety, but I'm also more appreciative of the ordinary moments, the uneventful walks where nothing sinister lurks in the shadows. I don't know if I'll ever fully move past what happened, but I'm learning to live with the uncertainty, to find a balance between vigilance and paranoia. And who knows, maybe someday I'll encounter that woman again and finally get the answers I've been seeking. Until then, I'll keep walking, keep watching, and keep wondering about the mysteries that hide in plain sight in our everyday world. I was out for my usual morning jog in the park, trying to clear my head and get some exercise before work. It was a crisp autumn day, leaves crunching under my feet as I made my way along the winding trail. About halfway through my run, I noticed something odd in the distance, a figure standing near the edge of the woods, holding what looked like balloons. As I got closer, I realized it was a clown. Not just any clown, but one with an eerily pale face, bright red nose, and a colorful wig. He was standing next to an old beige Toyota, silently holding a bunch of red balloons. Something about the scene felt off, but I couldn't quite put my finger on why. There were no kids around, no sign of any birthday party or event, just this lone clown, staring blankly ahead. I slowed my pace as I approached, a chill running down my spine despite the exertion of my run. The clown's gaze slowly shifted to me as I neared. His eyes were dark and empty, his painted-on smile somehow menacing. I gave a small nod, hoping to diffuse the tension, but he just continued to stare. As I passed by, I could feel his eyes boring into my back. I picked up my pace, eager to put some distance between us. When I glanced back over my shoulder, the clown was gone. The beige Toyota was still there, but no sign of the unsettling figure. I tried to shake off the creepy encounter and finished my run, but I couldn't stop thinking about it for days after. Fast forward 5 months. I'm at the movie theater with some friends, settling in to watch the latest horror flick. As the opening scenes play out, my blood runs cold. There on the screen is a clown, and not just any clown. It's the exact same one I saw that day in the park. Same pale makeup, same red nose, same colorful wig. Even the outfit is identical, down to the ruffled collar and polka dot jumpsuit. I grip the armrests of my seat, my palms suddenly sweaty. How is this possible? The movie was filmed over a year ago, long before my encounter in the park. Yet there's no mistaking it. This is the same clown, down to the smallest detail. My mind starts racing. Was what I saw that day somehow connected to this movie? Was it a promotion of some kind? A viral marketing stunt? But that doesn't make sense. The movie wasn't even being advertised yet when I saw the clown. And why would they have someone just standing silently in a random park? As the movie plays on, I can barely focus on the plot. Every time the clown appears on screen, I'm transported back to that unsettling morning in the park. The way he stared at me, the inexplicable feeling of dread that washed over me. It all comes flooding back. After the movie, I try to casually bring it up to my friends. Hey, did that clown remind anyone else of something they've seen before? They just shrug it off, talking about how all clowns look kind of similar and creepy. But I know this was different. This wasn't just a vague resemblance. It was identical. That night, I can't sleep. I toss and turn, my mind replaying both the movie scenes and my memory of the park over and over. I start to question everything. Did I really see that clown in the park? Was my mind playing tricks on me, somehow pulling this image from a movie trailer I don't remember seeing? But no, I'm certain it happened. I remember the crunching leaves, the chill in the air, the beige Toyota. It was real. The next day, I'm a wreck. I can't concentrate at work, constantly distracted by thoughts of the clown. On my lunch break, I start Googling frantically, searching for any connection between the movie and real-life clown sightings. I find nothing concrete, just vague urban legends and creepypasta stories that don't quite match up. I even drive back to the park, half hoping and half dreading that I'll see the clown again. But there's nothing out of the ordinary, just joggers and dog walkers enjoying the autumn weather. No sign of any creepy clowns or beige Toyotas. As days pass, I become increasingly obsessed. I watch the movie again, alone this time, pausing and rewinding every scene with the clown. I scrutinize every detail, comparing it to my memory. The similarity is undeniable. But how? Why? I start losing sleep, staying up late into the night researching clowns, movie production, even the psychology of memory. Could I have somehow fabricated this entire experience based on a subliminal image from a movie trailer? But that doesn't explain the visceral fear I felt that day, the way the hair on the back of my neck stood up when the clown stared at me. My friends start to worry about me. They tell me I'm obsessing, that I need to let it go. But I can't. This mystery consumes me. I feel like I'm going crazy, questioning my own memories and perceptions. Weeks turn into months, and I still have no answers. The movie fades from theaters, but my encounter with the clown remains burned into my memory. I find myself avoiding parks, tensing up every time I see a beige Toyota on the road. Sometimes late at night when I'm lying awake, I swear I can hear the faint sound of carnival music drifting through my window. But when I get up to look, there's never anything there, just the quiet, empty street. I don't know if I'll ever understand what really happened that day in the park. Was it a bizarre coincidence, some kind of elaborate prank, or something more sinister that I can't even begin to comprehend? All I know is that I'll never look at clowns the same way again. And every time I go for a run, I can't shake the feeling that somewhere, just out of sight, there's a pale face watching me from the shadows, silently holding a bunch of red balloons. My name's Jake, and I'm 19 years old. About 6 months ago, my dad disappeared without a trace. No note, no warning, nothing. He just vanished. At first, we thought maybe he'd had some kind of accident or emergency. But as days turned into weeks with no word, we realized something was seriously wrong. I couldn't just sit around waiting for answers, so I decided to try and find him myself. My mom was hesitant, but I think she understood. I needed to do something, anything, to figure out what happened. I started digging through Dad's stuff, looking for clues. That's when I found an old map with a town circled. Wrigley, a tiny village up in Canada. I'd never heard him mention it before, but it was the only lead I had. So I packed a bag, told my mom I'd check in daily, and hit the road. The drive to Wrigley took almost 2 days. As I got closer, the world seemed to get quieter. The roads narrowed, civilization thinned out. By the time I reached Wrigley, I felt like I'd stepped back in time. It was the kind of place where everyone knows everyone, you know? As soon as I pulled up to the local diner, I could feel eyes on me. I wasn't exactly subtle, asking around about my dad. Most people just shrugged or shook their heads, but then I met Chief Wilson. He was this gruff older guy, probably in his 60s. When I mentioned my dad's name, his whole demeanor changed. He got real quiet, then asked me to follow him down to the station. My heart was pounding the whole way there. At the station, Chief Wilson introduced me to Officer Mackenzie, a younger cop who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else. They sat me down and started asking questions. When was the last time I'd seen my dad? Did he ever mention Wrigley, that kind of thing? I answered as best I could, but I was getting frustrated. I came here for answers, not to be interrogated. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Look, I said, I just want to know what happened to my dad. Please, if you know anything, just tell me. Chief Wilson sighed, exchanged a look with Mackenzie, then turned back to me. Son, he said, your father's name came up in connection with a very old case here in Wrigley, a missing persons case from the 1970s. My mind was reeling. Dad would have been just a kid in the 70s. How could he be involved in something like that? What are you talking about? I demanded. Wilson pulled out an old file. In 1978, a university student named Susan Calvert went missing while camping in the woods just outside of Wrigley. She was never found. I shook my head. But what does that have to do with my dad? Mackenzie spoke up. Your father's name appeared in some of the witness statements from back then. He was camping in the same area around the time Susan disappeared. This didn't make any sense. Dad never mentioned anything about this. He didn't even like camping. There has to be some mistake, I said. Maybe, Wilson agreed. But here's the thing. About a month ago, your father showed up here in Wrigley. He was asking questions about the Calvert case, seemed real agitated about it. My heart skipped a beat. A month ago? That's right before he disappeared. Did he say anything else? Where he was going? Wilson shook his head. He was pretty tight-lipped. But he did say something strange before he left. Said he needed to finish what he started all those years ago. I felt like I was in some kind of bizarre dream. None of this made sense. So what happened then? Where did he go? Mackenzie cleared his throat. We're not sure. He headed out towards the old campgrounds where Susan disappeared. That was the last anyone saw of him. I stood up, my chair scraping against the floor. Then that's where I need to go. Can you tell me how to get there? Wilson looked concerned. Now hold on, son. Those woods can be dangerous, especially if you don't know your way around. Maybe we should... But I cut him off. I appreciate your concern, but I've come too far to stop now. Please, just give me directions to the campground. After some more back and forth, they finally relented. Wilson gave me a map and some basic supplies, made me promise to check in regularly. As I was leaving, Mackenzie pulled me aside. Listen, he said in a low voice. There's something else you should know. In the original statements about Susan's disappearance, there were some unusual details. Campers reported strange noises in the woods, lights they couldn't explain. And your dad, in his statement, he mentioned feeling like they were being watched by something not human. I stared at him, not sure what to say. Part of me wanted to laugh it off, but the look in Mackenzie's eyes was dead serious. Just be careful out there, okay? He said. I nodded, my mouth suddenly dry. As I walked out of the station, my mind was spinning. What had my dad gotten himself into? And more importantly, what was I walking into? The drive to the campgrounds was tense. The woods seemed to press in on either side of the narrow road, shadows deepening as the sun began to set. By the time I reached the entrance, twilight was settling in. I parked my car and grabbed my backpack, flashlight in hand. The campground seemed deserted, which wasn't surprising given how remote it was. As I started down one of the trails, the woods seemed to swallow up the beam of my flashlight. I'm not sure how long I walked. Time seemed to stretch and warp in the darkness. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves had me jumping. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Then I saw it, a flicker of light through the trees. My heart raced as I moved towards it, pushing through branches and undergrowth. As I broke into a small clearing, I froze. There, in the center of the clearing, was an old battered tent. A lantern glowed softly inside, casting strange shadows. And silhouetted against the tent was a figure, tall, still, facing away from me. My voice caught in my throat. "Dad?" I managed to croak out. The figure turned slowly. For a moment I thought I saw, but no, it couldn't be. In the blink of an eye, the clearing was empty. The tent, the lantern, the figure, all gone, as if they'd never been there at all. I stood there, shaking, for what felt like hours. When I finally managed to move again, I ran. I ran until I burst out of the woods, gasping for air, my legs burning. I drove back to town in a daze, my mind unable to process what I'd seen, or thought I'd seen. When I got back to the station, Wilson and Mackenzie were still there. They listened to my story with grim faces. "We'll send a team out in the morning," Wilson said. "But son, I think it might be time for you to head home." "But I can't. Not yet. There are too many questions left unanswered. What really happened to Susan Calvert all those years ago? What did my dad know about it? And what's out there in those woods? I'm staying in Wrigley for now. I'll keep searching, keep asking questions. Whatever's going on here, whatever happened to my dad, I'm going to get to the bottom of it. I have to. But I can't shake the feeling that I'm in way over my head, that there are things out there in the darkness that I can't begin to understand. And sometimes, late at night, I swear I can hear something moving outside my window, watching, waiting. I don't know how this story ends, but I'm going to find out, no matter what it takes. As I stumbled downstairs in search of aspirin and coffee, I was surprised to find my mom sitting alone at the kitchen table. She was staring blankly at her untouched mug of tea, still wearing her bathrobe even though it was nearly noon. Something felt off. "Mom, you okay?" I asked, my voice still raspy from sleep. She looked up at me, her eyes red-rimmed. "Your father's gone," she said flatly. I blinked, not comprehending. "What do you mean, gone? Like, to the store?" Mom shook her head slowly. "No. He left. Sometime in the night. His clothes, his car, they're gone." My hungover brain struggled to process this. "Wait, what? He just left without saying anything?" "There's no note. Nothing," Mom replied, her voice eerily calm. "I woke up and he wasn't there. His drawers were empty." I sank into a chair, my headache forgotten. This made no sense. Sure, my parents had their arguments like any couple, but nothing major. My dad wasn't the type to just walk out on his family. He was steady, reliable, the guy who never missed a Little League game or forgot an anniversary. "Did you try calling him?" I asked. "His phone's off. I've left messages." Mom took a sip of her cold tea and grimaced. Maybe he had some kind of work emergency," I suggested weakly. Mom just shrugged, her face a mask. The next few days passed in a haze of confusion and unanswered questions. I kept expecting Dad to walk through the door with some crazy explanation. His car broke down in the middle of nowhere. He got abducted by aliens, anything. But as the days turned into weeks, the reality began to sink in. My father was gone, vanished without a trace. Mom seemed to shut down emotionally. She went through the motions of daily life, going to work, making dinner, but it was like she was on autopilot. Whenever I tried to talk to her about Dad, she'd change the subject or suddenly remember an urgent errand. One night, about a month after Dad disappeared, I worked up the courage to press her for answers. We were eating a silent dinner of microwaved leftovers when I finally blurted out, "Mom, we have to talk about this. About Dad. What really happened?" She set down her fork with a clatter. "There's nothing to talk about. He left us. End of story." But why? I persisted. It doesn't make any sense. Did something happen? Did you guys have a fight? Mom's face clouded over. I told you, I don't know why he left, she snapped. Just drop it, okay? But I couldn't let it go. Her reaction only convinced me that she knew more than she was letting on. Why was she so reluctant to discuss it? What was she hiding? Unable to get answers at home, I started my own investigation. I combed through Dad's office, looking for any clues he might have left behind. I called his work, his friends, even distant relatives, but no one seemed to know anything, or if they did, they weren't talking. I was about ready to give up when I stumbled across an old shoebox tucked away in the back of Dad's closet. Inside were newspaper clippings, mostly from the mid-1970s. They all related to the same story, the disappearance of a young woman named Jennifer Lane from our small town. I vaguely remembered hearing about the case. It was one of those local legends, a mystery that had never been solved. Jennifer had vanished without a trace one summer night in 1975. The initial investigation turned up nothing, and eventually the case went cold. But why did my dad have all these old articles? He would have been in his early 20s when Jennifer disappeared. As I dug deeper into the box, my heart started racing. There was a faded photograph of a group of young people at what looked like a beach party. I recognized my dad immediately, his arms slung casually around a pretty blonde girl. On the back, someone had scrawled, "Lake Party, July 4th, 1975. The blonde was Jennifer Lane. My father knew her. My mind was reeling. Why had Dad never mentioned knowing Jennifer? And why keep all this stuff hidden away? A sick feeling started to grow in the pit of my stomach. Could my father somehow have been involved in Jennifer's disappearance? I confronted my mom with what I'd found, hoping it might finally get her to open up. But her reaction was explosive. "Where did you get those?" she shrieked, snatching the box from my hands. "You had no right to go through your father's things." "Mom, please," I begged. "I'm just trying to understand what's going on. Did Dad have something to do with Jennifer Lane's disappearance?" The color drained from her face. "Don't you dare," she hissed. "Don't you dare accuse your father of something like that. He was a good man." Was, past tense. The slip didn't escape my notice. "Mom," I said quietly, "do you know what happened to Dad? Please, just tell me the truth." For a moment I thought she might finally crack, but then the walls came slamming back up. "I've told you everything I know," she insisted, her voice shaking. "Now get out of my sight." She locked herself in her bedroom after that, refusing to speak to me for days. But her reaction only fueled my determination to get to the bottom of things. I threw myself into researching Jennifer Lane's disappearance, poring over old newspaper archives and court records. I tracked down people who knew Jennifer, including her younger sister who still lived in town. Most leads went nowhere, but slowly I started to piece together a picture. Jennifer had last been seen leaving a party at the lake on July 4th, 1975. Witnesses reported seeing her arguing with a man in the parking lot before driving off. Her car was found abandoned on a lonely stretch of road the next day, but Jennifer was never seen again. The man she'd been arguing with was never identified, but the more I dug, the more convinced I became that it had been my father. He'd known Jennifer, had been at that party, and now, over 20 years later, he'd vanished just as mysteriously as she had. What if Jennifer hadn't disappeared at all? What if my father had been involved in her death and had been living with that secret all these years? Had something made him finally snap, unable to bear the guilt any longer? The possibilities made me sick to my stomach. I didn't want to believe my father capable of such a thing. But the evidence was piling up, and my mother's strange behavior only added to my suspicions. Then came the breaking point. I was up late one night, unable to sleep, when I heard muffled sobs coming from my mom's room. I crept to her door, prepared to comfort her, but what I overheard stopped me cold. "I'm sorry," she was saying between ragged breaths. "I'm so sorry. I should have told the truth years ago. Maybe then none of this would have happened." My blood ran cold. She knew. She'd known all along what my father had done. I burst into the room, startling her. "Mom, you have to tell me what's going on, now. No more lies." She looked at me with red, swollen eyes, all the fight gone out of her. And finally, haltingly, the truth came spilling out. My father had indeed been involved in Jennifer Lane's death, but not in the way I'd imagined. It had been a terrible accident. Jennifer, drunk and distraught after an argument with her boyfriend, had stumbled into the road. My father, also not entirely sober, hadn't seen her in time. Panicked and afraid of ruining his future, he'd hidden her body and sworn my mother to secrecy. They'd been living with the burden of that lie ever since. He tried so hard to be a good man, to make up for it, my mom said, her voice barely above a whisper. But the guilt, it was eating him alive. And then last month they found Jennifer's remains in the woods. He knew it was only a matter of time before the truth came out. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut. My father hadn't just disappeared, he'd run. Run from the law, from the consequences of his actions all those years ago. Everything I thought I knew about my family had been built on a foundation of lies. In the days that followed, I struggled to come to terms with this new reality. Part of me wanted to turn my father in, to finally bring closure to Jennifer's family. But another part of me understood the impossible situation my parents had found themselves in. In the end, I decided to keep their secret. Not for my father's sake, but for my mother's. She'd suffered enough. We never heard from my father again. Sometimes I imagine him out there somewhere, still running from his past. Other times, in my darkest moments, I wonder if he found a more permanent escape from his guilt. The truth is, I'll probably never know what really happened to my father that August night in 1996. Just like Jennifer Lane's family, I'm left with nothing but questions and what-ifs. It's a weight I'll carry for the rest of my life, the legacy of one terrible mistake and years of lies. Sometimes I still find myself hoping that one day I'll get a call or a letter, some explanation, some closure. But deep down, I know that's unlikely. My father is gone, taking his secrets with him. And all I can do is try to live with the shattered remains of the life I thought I knew.